I was 35 years old the day I realised my parents didn't just overlook me, they erased me. My brother's wedding, the event they'd spent a year planning a fortune funding. And me, I wasn't listed as family. I was listed as staff. Brittany, refill the champagne. Brittany, the centerpieces are crooked. Brittany, don't embarrass us in front of the CEO. My father's boss, the man they'd been desperate to impress for months. I watched them fawn over him, boasting about their golden son while I served drinks in a staff apron. I smiled through it all, because I had a secret. You see that CEO? He'd been searching for someone for 3 months, someone who'd saved his company from collapse, someone brilliant, elusive, impossible to track down, someone named Miss B. Shaw. And when he walked into that reception hall and saw my name tag, everything stopped. Miss Shaw, hushing me up, Shaw. His voice cut through the music. I've been trying to reach you for months. Shaw, 200 guests turned to stare. My father's wine glass trembled. My mother went pale, and I finally stopped smiling, because this story, it's about what happens when the invisible daughter becomes impossible to ignore. Stay with me. You won't believe how this ends. My name is Brittany Shaw. I'm 35 years old, a freelance technology consultant, and for most of my life, I've been my family's best-kept secret. Not because I'm a failure, quite the opposite. But success, I learned early, is only celebrated in my family when it belongs to my younger brother, Brandon. The wedding invitation arrived on a Tuesday, cream-coloured cardstock embossed lettering the works. My mother had spared no expense. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, turning the envelope over in my hands, feeling that familiar flutter of hope. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe they'd finally see me as more than an afterthought. I opened it carefully, almost reverently. The main card was beautiful. Brandon Shaw and Claire Montgomery request the pleasure of your company. I smiled. My little brother was getting married. But then I saw the second card tucked behind the first. A smaller note handwritten in my mother's precise script. Brittany, we need help coordinating day of logistics. You're listed as event coordinator assistant. Arrive Friday to prep. Don't bring a +1. Space is limited. Not a guest, an assistant, unpaid staff at my own brother's wedding. I set the invitation down and stared at it for a long time. 35 years of this. 35 years of being the family's invisible daughter, the one who didn't quite fit the narrative they wanted to tell. The memories came flooding back, uninvited but familiar. I was 8 years old, standing on a stage in a too big blazer, clutching a trophy for first place in the state science fair. I'd built a working model of a water filtration system. The judges called it exceptionally advanced for her age. I remember scanning the audience for my father's face, desperate to see him proud. He wasn't there. He was at Brandon's Little League game. Brandon, who spent the entire game picking dandelions in the outfield. When I got home that night, trophy in hand, my father was watching television. "That's nice, kiddo," he said without looking up. The trophy went on a shelf in my room. Brandon's participation ribbons went on the mantel. Then, there was college graduation. I'd worked 2 jobs to put myself through school, graduated summa cum laude with a degree in computer science. As I walked across that stage, master's diploma in hand, I spotted my parents in the crowd. My mother was dabbing her eyes with a tissue. My father was on his phone. I found out later he was texting updates about Brandon's baseball game to relatives. Brandon, who'd dropped out of his 3rd college that semester. But it was my grandfather's voice that haunted me most. I was 12, eavesdropping from the top of the stairs while he visited. Richard, he told my father, his voice hard and cold, "A man who raises successful daughters is weak. Real men raise sons who conquer. You remember that?" My father never forgot. I picked up the invitation again, reading that line one more time. Event coordinator assistant. I should have thrown it away. Should have finally drawn the line and said no. But some stubborn, foolish part of me still hoped. Maybe if I showed up, worked hard, didn't make waves, maybe they'd finally see me. Maybe this time I'd be enough. I packed my bag for the wedding 2 days later. I folded my nicest dress, the one I'd been saving for a special occasion. I packed the pearl earrings my grandmother left me before she died. I packed hope wrapped carefully between layers of tissue paper and self-deception. What I didn't know was that this trip would finally show me who my family really was and who I'd become despite them. The 5-hour drive to my childhood home gave me too much time to think. I'd stopped at 3 different stores to find the perfect gifts. For Brandon and Claire, I'd chosen a vintage compass engraved with your "May you always find your way home." For my parents, a coffee table book of family photographs through the decades. Thoughtful, meaningful. The kind of gifts that said, "I care. I'm trying, I'm still here." I pulled into the driveway at 4 in the afternoon. Brandon's truck was already there, freshly washed and gleaming. So was Claire's white Mercedes. Through the front window, I could see movement, hear laughter. I sat in my car for a moment, gifts arranged carefully on the passenger seat, and took a deep breath. The front door opened before I could knock. My mother appeared, but she wasn't looking at me. She was craning her neck to see past me toward the driveway. "Oh, Brittany," she said, her tone flattening with recognition. "You're here. Did you park in front of the garage? Brandon might need to move his truck later." No hug, no smile, just a logistical concern about parking arrangements. "I parked on the street," I said, holding up the gift bags. "I brought Brandon, Claire." My mother's voice transformed suddenly warm and musical. She brushed past me as my brother and his fiancé emerged from the living room. "There you are. We were just talking about the seating chart. Claire darling, your mother called. She loves the floral arrangements." I watched my mother wrap Claire in an embrace, then cup Brandon's face with both hands. "My handsome boy, are you getting nervous? Only 2 more days?" Brandon grinned, that easy, confident smile he'd always had. "Nah, Mom, I'm ready." Then he noticed me standing in the doorway, still holding the gifts. "Oh, hey Britt, when did you get here?" "Just now," I said. My father appeared from his study, reading glasses perched on his nose. He clapped Brandon on the shoulder in that way fathers do with sons they're proud of. "There's my boy. CEO Jameson confirmed he's coming. This is big son, big connections for your future." I cleared my throat. "Hi, Dad." He glanced at me briefly, distracted. "Brittany, good. Your mother has a list of things that need doing. Better get settled in." He turned back to Brandon. "Now, when Jameson arrives at the rehearsal dinner, I want you to—" "Where should I put my things?" I interrupted, hating how small my voice sounded. My mother waved vaguely toward the back of the house. "Oh, we put you in the basement guest room, the one with the washing machine. Brandon and Claire have the master suite upstairs, and we're keeping the other guest rooms for Claire's family. They're coming from Boston, you understand. The basement, with the washing machine, where we used to store Christmas decorations and broken furniture waiting to be fixed." "Of course," I said. I carried my suitcase down the narrow basement stairs myself. No one offered to help. The room was exactly as I remembered: cement floors covered by a thin rug, a twin bed pushed against the wall, the steady hum of the washing machine in the corner. A small window near the ceiling let in a shaft of grey afternoon light. This was where my parents housed their daughter, while the guest rooms upstairs remained empty, reserved for people who mattered. I unpacked mechanically, hanging my dress in the cramped closet, setting my toiletries on the metal shelving unit. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and let myself feel it, the weight of being unwanted in your own family home. I needed air. I needed space. I grabbed my jacket and slipped out through the basement door into the backyard and beyond. The cemetery was a 15-minute walk. I'd been visiting since I was 16, since the day my grandmother died, and took with her the only person who'd ever made me feel seen. Her grave was in the northeast corner beneath an old oak tree. I knelt in the grass, tracing her name with my finger. "Hi, Grandma," I whispered. "I'm back." That's when I noticed it. Tucked beneath a small stone at the base of her headstone, protected from the weather by a plastic sleeve, were 2 cream-coloured envelopes. My name was written on the plastic in her handwriting. My heart hammered as I pulled them free. The first envelope read, "Open when you need strength." The second, "Open when you're ready to forgive." I stared at them, my grandmother's final gifts hidden and waiting. How long had they been here? Who had placed them? My hands shook as I tucked them carefully into my jacket pocket. Not yet. I wasn't ready yet. I walked back slowly, my mind spinning. When I reached the house, I heard my mother's voice drifting through the open kitchen window. She was on the phone, her tone light and conspiratorial. No, Josh, don't worry about Brittany," she was saying. "She's helping with setup. She knows her place. She won't cause any trouble. She never does." I stood there in the darkening evening, hidden by the shadow of the house, listening to my mother dismiss me to whoever was on the other end of that line. And something inside me, something that had been cracking for 35 years, finally began to break. I didn't sleep well that night. The washing machine kicked on at 2 a.m, someone's last-minute load of laundry rumbling through the spin cycle 3 feet from my head. I lay there in the dark, my grandmother's envelopes tucked under my pillow, and wondered what I was doing here. Morning came too early. I was awoken by my mother's voice calling down the basement stairs. "Brittany, we need you upstairs, now, please." I pulled on jeans and a sweater and climbed up to find the kitchen, transformed into a command centre. My mother stood at the island, surrounded by clipboards, seating charts and ribbon samples. She looked up as I entered and without preamble thrust a bundle of navy fabric into my arms. "Here," she said, "put this on." I unfolded it, an apron, navy blue with white piping and the words "wedding staff" embroidered across the chest in elegant script. "Mum, what is this?" "The hired help cancelled last minute," she said, already turning back to her clipboard. "Some kind of scheduling conflict with another event. We need you to fill in. It's just family anyway. No one will mind." "I'm not staff," I said quietly. "I'm your daughter." She looked at me, then really looked at me, and her expression was so matter-of-fact it hurt more than anger would have. "Brittany, don't be difficult. Brandon's getting married. This is important. We need all hands on deck. You're always saying you want to help the family. Well, here's your chance." The apron hung heavy in my hands. I thought about refusing, thought about walking out, driving away, finally drawing that line I should have drawn years ago. But that small stubborn part of me, the part that still hoped, whispered that maybe if I just helped, just proved myself useful, they'd finally see my value. I put on the apron. The next 6 hours were a blur of manual labour. My mother handed me a printed task list, set up the gift table arrange. 300 chairs in precise rows, steam the tablecloths, polish the silverware, create centerpieces from the boxes of flowers that had been delivered. I worked steadily, my hands busy while my mind went numb. Around noon, guests began arriving for the rehearsal. Distant relatives, family friends, my father's colleagues from work. I was carrying a tray of champagne flutes to the outdoor bar when I heard my father's booming voice. "Jim, Barbara, so glad you could make it early." He was greeting a couple I vaguely recognised from childhood, one of his old golf buddies and his wife. They smiled warmly, and then the wife's gaze landed on me. "Richard, is this Brittany? My goodness, she's all grown up." My father glanced at me as if noticing me for the first time that day. "Oh, yes, Brittany's helping out today. We needed some extra hands." Not, "This is my daughter." Not, "Brittany's here for her brother's wedding." Just helping out, like I was a hired contractor, a temp worker. Barbara's smile faltered slightly, confused, but Jim was already asking about Brandon, and my father smoothly redirected the conversation. I stood there for a moment, invisible in my staff apron, then continued to the bar. The afternoon continued in the same vein. I served drinks to people who had known me since childhood, none of them questioning why I was working instead of celebrating. I refilled water pitchers, collected empty plates, adjusted crooked chair covers. At one point, my mother's sister, Aunt Carol, grabbed my arm as I passed. "Sweetie, can you get me another napkin?" I spilled. She handed me her wine-stained napkin without a flicker of recognition that anything was wrong with this picture. "Of course, Aunt Carol," I said. By 4 o'clock, my feet ached and my hands smelled like furniture polish. That's when the photographer arrived for family pictures. I watched from the kitchen doorway as my mother organised everyone on the front lawn. Brandon and Claire in the centre, my parents flanking them, grandparents and cousins filling in the frame. "That's perfect," the photographer called. "Everyone hold still." I started to step forward to join them, but still wearing my ridiculous apron. My mother's hand shot out, stopping me. "Not now, Brittany," she murmured. "We're doing immediate family first. We'll get one with you later." But later never came. I watched through the window as they took shot after shot. Formal poses, candid laughs, Brandon lifting Claire in his arms, my father's proud hand on Brandon's shoulder, my mother dabbing happy tears. An hour of photographs documenting a family I apparently wasn't part of. When they finally came inside, my mother was scrolling through the preview images on the photographer's camera. "Oh, this one is lovely," she said, stopping on a wide shot of everyone gathered on the lawn. "But we need to crop it tighter. Cut out that bush on the left side. It ruins the composition." I looked closer. I'd been standing near that bush just at the edge of the frame. My mother wanted to crop me out to make the composition better. Evening fell. The rehearsal dinner wound down. I collected dirty dishes and folded chairs while everyone else laughed over champagne. My back screamed. My hands were raw from hot water and cleaning solution. Around 9, as I was wiping down the bar, I ducked into the kitchen for more paper towels. That's when I saw it. Taped to the refrigerator, printed on plain white paper, the staff schedule for tomorrow's ceremony. I stepped closer, reading down the list of names and assigned duties. At the very top, under the header, Unpaid Volunteers, was my name, Brittany Shaw. Below me, Maria Rodriguez Catering. And below, her John Chen parking attendant. I stood there staring at that sheet of paper, at my name ranked among the help. Not family, not even paid staff. An unpaid volunteer. Rated alongside the person managing the parking lot. Something crystallized in that moment, something cold and sharp. All those years of hoping, of trying, of believing that somehow someday they'd see me. It had all been a fantasy. This was who they were. This was who they'd always been. I found the staff schedule posted in the kitchen. Under Unpaid Volunteers, my name was listed first. Below it, Maria Cadgering and John Parking. I was ranked with the parking attendant. God, I stared at that staff schedule for a long moment, then carefully folded it and slipped it into my pocket. Evidence, proof. I wasn't imagining this. It was right there in black and white, printed and posted for anyone to see. My name ranked with the help. The rehearsal dinner was set to begin at 7. My mother had transformed the backyard into something from a magazine spread, string lights draped between trees, long tables covered in cream linens, arrangements of white roses and eucalyptus at every setting. It was beautiful. It was also a stage, and I was crew, not cast. By 6:45, guests were filtering outside, cocktails in hand. I changed my apron for a fresh one this time, with my name embroidered below the wedding staff logo. My mother had insisted. "So people know who to ask for help," she'd explained, as if that made it better. I picked up a tray of wine glasses, balanced it carefully, and stepped into the warm evening air. Laughter floated across the lawn. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, offering glasses, murmuring red or white to people who didn't quite meet my eyes. That's when I heard my father's voice rise above the rest, vibrant with pride and something else. Desperation, maybe. The need to impress. "Mr. Jameson, you made it. We're so honoured you could join us." I turned, nearly sloshing wine onto my apron. There, near the entrance to the garden, stood a man in his early 60s. Silver hair, sharp suit, the bearing of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. CEO Jameson, my father's boss, the man my parents had been obsessing over for months. My father was pumping his hand enthusiastically, then turned to pull Brandon forward. "This is my son, Brandon, the groom. Brandon, this is Alexander Jameson, CEO of Jameson Corporation." Brandon, to his credit, shook hands with appropriate respect, but not fawning. "Mr. Jameson, thank you so much for coming. It means a lot to my family." "Wouldn't miss it, son," Jameson said warmly. His voice was deep, measured, the kind of voice I'm used to being listened to. "Your father speaks very highly of you. MBA from Stanford, is that right?" "Yes, sir. Just finished last year." My father beamed, practically glowing. "Top of his class. Brandon's got a real head for business, strategic thinking, leadership potential. I keep telling him he's got a bright future ahead." I stood 15 feet away, holding a tray of wine, listening to my father enumerate my brother's virtues to his boss. Brandon hadn't graduated top of his class. He'd graduated period after dropping out of 2 other programs. But truth had never been an obstacle when it came to polishing Brandon's image. "That's excellent," Jameson was saying. "We need sharp, young minds in the industry. Richard, you've done well raising him." My father's chest puffed up. This was what he'd wanted. Validation from the man who controlled his career, his reputation, his future. And Brandon was his golden ticket, his proof of successful fatherhood. I moved closer, offering wine to nearby guests, trying to remain invisible while staying close enough to hear. I didn't know why it mattered. Maybe I was punishing myself, forcing myself to witness exactly how little I factored into my father's definition of success. "Mr. Jameson, can I offer you some wine?" I heard myself say. He turned, and I found myself looking into sharp blue eyes that took me in with a single assessing glance. The staff apron, the tray of glasses, the subservient posture I'd unconsciously adopted. "Red, please," he said kindly. I selected a glass and extended it carefully. As he reached for it, his hand bumped mine just slightly, and the sudden movement made me flinch. The glass tilted. Wine splashed a dark red stain blooming across his crisp white shirt cuff. "Oh, God, I'm so sorry," I gasped, setting down the tray with shaking hands. My mother materialized out of nowhere, her face a mask of horror. "Brittany, for heaven's sake, be more careful." Her voice was sharp, cutting, designed to carry, designed to show Jameson that she was properly appalled by her staff's incompetence. "Mr. Jameson, I'm so terribly sorry. She's usually not this clumsy." Heat flooded my face. Around us, conversations had stopped. People were staring, but Jameson waved his hand dismissively. No, it was entirely my fault. I moved too quickly. Please, don't worry about it." He pulled out a handkerchief and dabbed at the stain, then looked up at me with a smile that seemed genuine. "No harm done?" I grabbed napkins from a nearby table, crouching to wipe at the drops that had fallen to the ground, desperate to disappear. My mother was still hovering, apologizing profusely, and my father had joined her, his face tight with embarrassment. "She's helping out with the event," my father was explaining, as if that excused everything, as if that explained why his daughter was serving drinks instead of sitting at the family table. Jameson looked at me more closely, then his gaze dropping to the name badge on my apron. "Brittany Shaw," he read aloud. His brow furrowed slightly. "Shaw? Same last name as you, Richard." "My daughter," my father said shortly, the words seeming to cost him something. "Ah." Jameson's eyes stayed on my face, and something shifted in his expression, recognition trying to surface. "Brittany Shaw," he repeated slower this time, as if tasting the syllables. "That name. It sounds familiar. Have we met before?" My heart stopped. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. My father laughed, the sound forced. "I don't think so. Brittany works in, well, she does freelance work, various projects, nothing in your sphere, I'm sure." Jameson was still looking at me, and I could see his mind working, trying to place me. What kind of freelance work? Technology consulting. I managed my voice barely above a whisper. His eyes sharpened. Technology consulting. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. Forgive me, this is going to bother me all evening. I'm terrible with names, but I never forget a face. I watched frozen as he unlocked his screen and opened his browser. His fingers moved across the keyboard, and even from where I stood, I could see what he was typing. Be sure, contact information. The search loaded. His eyes scanned the results, then widened. His head snapped up, and he stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Shock? Disbelief? Recognition? He began. But my father, oblivious, had already grabbed his elbow. Mr. Jameson, there are some other people I'd love you to meet. Brandon's future in-laws just arrived from Boston. He was already steering Jameson away toward another cluster of guests. Jameson glanced back at me over his shoulder, his phone still in his hand, his expression transformed. He'd figured it out. Whatever he'd been searching for, he'd found it. As I cleaned it up the wine, CEO Jameson pulled out his phone. I saw him type into his search bar, be sure, contact information. His eyes widened. Then my father pulled him away to meet more guests. I stood there with wine-stained napkins clutched in my hands, watching my father guide CEO Jameson toward the in-laws, and I knew. He'd figured it out. After all my careful anonymity, all my precautions, one search on his phone, and he'd connected the dots. Brittany Shaw, B.G. Shaw, the consultant he'd been desperately trying to find. The consultant his own senior manager had rejected 7 years ago. I needed air. I needed to think. I deposited the napkins in a bin and slipped away from the party into the quiet darkness beyond the string lights. My hands were trembling. Not from fear, exactly, from the weight of a secret that was about to stop being secret. Let me tell you how this happened. Let me tell you about the woman my father never knew I'd become. It started in 2018. I was 28, fresh off a successful consulting project for a mid-sized tech firm, and I was ready to go legitimate, to stop freelancing and join a real company, build a career, maybe even make my father proud, though I wouldn't have admitted that motivation to anyone, least of all myself. Jameson Corporation was expanding their technology division. They needed someone who understood both the technical architecture and the business strategy. I was perfect for it. I knew I was perfect for it. I spent 3 weeks on my application crafting my resume, writing a cover letter that outlined exactly how I could transform their struggling digital infrastructure. I submitted it through their online portal, and then I did something I'd never done before. I sent a follow-up email directly to the hiring manager for the division. That hiring manager was Richard Shaw, my father. I thought maybe, finally, this could be the bridge between us. He'd see my qualifications on paper, see what I had accomplished, and he'd champion me. His daughter, brilliant and capable, joining his company, working alongside him. 3 days later, I received a form rejection email. I was confused. My qualifications were exceptional. I had every certification they'd listed, plus experience they hadn't even thought to ask for. So I called HR, asked if there was any feedback. The woman on the phone was kind but firm. Your application was rejected at the department level. The hiring manager noted that you were overqualified and not a good culture fit. Overqualified. Not a good culture fit. I requested the full application notes through a friend who worked in their HR department. It took some convincing, but she finally sent me a screenshot. There, in the notes field in my father's handwriting on a scanned form, applicant seems capable but would be disruptive to team dynamic. Recommend pass. My own father had torpedoed my application. He'd seen my name, seen my credentials, and decided his department was no place for me. That rejection changed everything. If I couldn't succeed as Brittany Shaw daughter, trying to earn her father's respect, then I'd succeed as someone else entirely. I rebranded, started using my middle initial instead of my first name. Became Ms. B. Shaw, independent consultant. I set up a separate email, a PO box, a business entity that was legally mine, but publicly anonymous. When clients asked to meet in person, I declined. All communication via email and phone. My work would speak for itself, unencumbered by gender, by family connection, by anyone's preconceived notions of who I was supposed to be. And the work did speak, loudly. In 2019, Jameson Corporation nearly collapsed. They'd invested heavily in an automated logistics system that was hemorrhaging money, failing spectacularly, threatening to take the entire company down with it. They were weeks from mass layoffs. The board was in chaos. Someone in their IT department had heard of Ms. B. Shaw, a consultant who'd salvaged 3 supposedly unsalvageable tech projects in the past year. They reached out desperate. I took the contract. Not because I wanted to save my father's job, though. That was an unintended side effect. I took it because it was the kind of impossible problem I loved solving. They gave me access to everything: code budgets, team structures, communication logs. I spent 72 hours straight analysing their disaster. Then I wrote Project Phoenix. The strategy was comprehensive. Restructure the automation workflow, integrate it with their existing systems. Instead of replacing them, retrain staff and implement a phased rollback protocol for failures. It wasn't revolutionary. It was just good, solid systems thinking applied to a problem everyone was too panicked to think clearly about. I delivered the full proposal to CEO Jameson directly. 50 pages of analysis and implementation strategy. He called me the next day. "Ms. Shaw," he'd said, his voice filled with something close to awe. "This is brilliant. You've essentially rebuilt our entire approach. If this works, it will work." I'd interrupted. "Then you've saved this company. I'd like to meet you, bring you on permanently, name your price." I'd declined, politely but firmly. "I prefer to work remotely, Mr. Jameson. My anonymity is important to me, but I'll be available for consultation during implementation." He tried to persuade me, but I'd held firm. Because the moment he saw my face, learned my real identity, the narrative would change. I'd become Richard Shaw's daughter, who helped Daddy's company, not the consultant who saved Jameson Corporation. Project Phoenix was implemented over 6 months. It worked exactly as I'd promised. The company stabilized, grew, thrived. My father received a commendation for his department's successful transition, never knowing his daughter had architected the entire thing. I moved on to other projects, other clients, other impossible problems to solve. The Jameson contract ended, and Ms. B. Shaw disappeared back into the shadows of the consulting world, until 3 months ago when Alexander Jameson started searching for me again. A new crisis, a different kind of problem. The company was planning a major expansion, and Jameson wanted the strategic mind behind Project Phoenix to help guide it. But more than that, he wanted to offer Ms. B. Shaw a seat on the board of directors, a permanent position, a partnership. His HR department had tried everything. The old email bounced, the PO box had been closed, the phone number disconnected. I'd changed everything after the Jameson project ended, as I always did. Staying invisible meant staying mobile. He'd been searching for 3 months, growing increasingly frustrated. I'd seen the LinkedIn requests, the emails to my old contacts, the job postings that were clearly designed to lure me out. Seeking strategic consultant with Phoenix project experience. I'd ignored them all, because I was happy in the shadows, because I didn't need validation, because Miss B. Shaw was free in a way Brittany Shaw had never been. And now, here we were, Alexander Jameson at my brother's wedding, desperate to find a consultant he couldn't locate. Standing 20 feet away from her while she cleaned up spilled wine in a staff apron. About to discover that the invisible woman he'd been hunting for months was the invisible daughter of his trusted senior manager. The irony was perfect. The CEO was attending his trusted manager's son's wedding, desperate to find a consultant, who was serving him wine. I took a steadying breath and returned to the party, my professional mask firmly in place. The rehearsal dinner had moved into full swing. Guests laughed over appetizers, champagne flowed freely, and I moved among them like a shadow, refilling glasses and clearing plates. CEO Jameson was deep in conversation with Brandon's future in-laws, though I caught him glancing my direction more than once, his expression thoughtful and unsettled. I was arranging dessert plates on the buffet table when Claire approached. My brother's fiancé was beautiful in that effortless way some women manage blonde hair in perfect beach waves designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent diamond bracelet catching the string lights. She'd been pleasant enough to me over the past year in that distant way people are pleasant to service workers. Polite, but not warm. Present, but not engaged. Tonight, though, something was different. There was a sharpness to her smile as she picked up a champagne flute from my tray. "Brittany," she said, her tone light and conversational. "I have to ask, what do you do again, for work, I mean?" I kept my expression neutral. "I'm a technology consultant. Freelance?" "Oh, that's right. Freelance." She drew out the word, making it sound like a euphemism for unemployed. "So you're between jobs right now?" "I'm between contracts," I corrected quietly. "Must be nice," she continued, taking a sip of champagne. "Having all that free time, no commitments, no deadlines, just flexible." The way she said flexible made it sound like lazy. I couldn't live like that personally. I need structure, purpose, but I guess some people are just wired differently. Heat crept up my neck. Around us, a few guests had paused their conversations, tuning into ours. Claire's voice had that particular carrying quality, the kind that seems casual, but is precisely calculated to be overheard. "I keep quite busy," I said, picking up another tray of empty glasses. "I'm sure you do," Claire said sweetly. "All this wedding stuff, for instance. Your mum mentioned you've been such a help, setting up chairs, arranging flowers. It's so generous of you to pitch in. Not everyone would be willing to do that kind of work, especially at their own brother's wedding." She paused, her smile widening. "But I guess when you've got the free time..." I looked at her directly, then really looked at her and saw something I'd missed before. This wasn't casual conversation. This was calculated cruelty, delivered with a smile. She wanted to humiliate me, and she wanted an audience for it. "If you'll excuse me," I said, turning away. "Of course," she called after me. "Don't let me keep you from your duties." I retreated to the kitchen, my hands shaking as I set down the tray. I dealt with condescension before, with being underestimated and dismissed, but there was something particularly cutting about Claire's performance. She'd identified the exact wound and pressed on it with surgical precision. I spent the next 20 minutes in the kitchen, helping the real caterers organise dessert service, grateful for tasks that kept me away from the party. When I finally emerged, carrying a tray of coffee cups, I found a small commotion near the gift table. Claire stood at the centre of a knot of concerned women, her hand pressed to her chest dramatically. "I don't understand," she was saying, her voice pitched with distress. "It was right here. I set it down when I went to the bathroom. My grandmother's bracelet. It's been in our family for 3 generations. My mother had appeared, her face creased with concern. "Are you sure you didn't leave it in the bathroom? Or maybe in the house?" "I'm positive," Claire insisted. "I remember taking it off and setting it right here on this table. Someone must have taken it." The crowd around her had grown. I stood at the edge, coffee tray in hand, watching this unfold with a sinking feeling in my stomach. I knew where this was going before anyone said a word. "Well," Aunt Carol said hesitantly, "who's been near the gift table?" Several people glanced around, uncomfortable with the implication. Then my mother's eyes landed on me. I watched the calculation happen in real time, the slight narrowing of her eyes, the way her mouth tightened. "Brittany's been moving around all evening," she said slowly, clearing plates, collecting glasses. She didn't say I'd stolen anything. She didn't have to. The suggestion hung in the air, ugly and unmistakable. Claire turned to look at me, her eyes wide and innocent. "Oh, I'm sure Brittany wouldn't... I mean..." She's family. Of course she wouldn't, my mother said, but her tone said otherwise. But perhaps we should just check, to rule it out. Brittany, honey, could you let us look in your bag just so we can be sure? The coffee tray felt heavy in my hands. Around me, 40 guests had stopped their conversations. Everyone was watching, waiting to see if the staff member would submit to a search. You want to search my bag? I said. It wasn't a question. It's just a formality, my mother said, already moving toward the kitchen where I'd left my purse. Claire's very upset. It's a family heirloom. I'm sure you understand. She returned with my purse, a worn leather crossbody I'd had for 5 years. She opened it without asking permission, her hands rifling through my belongings. Wallet, keys, phone, lip balm, tissues, and then her fingers closed around something at the bottom, something that clinked against her rings as she pulled it out. Claire's diamond bracelet glittering in the string lights. The silence was absolute. My mother stared at the bracelet in her hand, her face a mixture of shock and something else. Vindication, maybe. Confirmation of what she'd always suspected about her disappointing daughter. Brittany, she breathed. How could you... I looked at Claire. Her face was the picture of shocked betrayal, but I saw it, the tiny flicker of satisfaction in her eyes, the ghost of a smile she couldn't quite suppress. I didn't take it, I said calmly. It's in your bag, my mother said, her voice rising. Right here. We all see it. Someone put it there, I said. Someone who had access to both the bracelet and my purse. Claire's hand flew to her mouth. Are you saying I planted my own grandmother's bracelet in your bag? Why would I do that? That's an excellent question, I said. I looked around at the assembled guests, at their shocked faces, their eagerness for drama. Then I pulled out my phone. You know what's interesting? After being blamed for things I didn't do my entire childhood, I developed a habit. Call it self-preservation. I opened my phone and navigated to an app. I installed security cameras in my room, the basement room where I'm staying. They're motion-activated, record directly to cloud storage. I looked up at Claire, and one of them has a very clear view of my bag, which I left on the chair near the basement door while I worked. Claire's face had gone white. The satisfied gleam in her eyes vanished, replaced by something close to panic. Want to see who put it there? I asked conversationally. That's not necessary, Claire said quickly. I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe it fell into your bag somehow. These things happen. Do they? I looked at my mother, who was still holding the bracelet, confusion replacing certainty on her face. Because it seems like a pretty specific accusation to make if you're not sure. The crowd had shifted. Now they weren't looking at me with suspicion. They were looking at Claire, at her pale face and trembling hands, and making their own calculations. I took a step closer to Claire, close enough that only she could hear my next words. I have the footage, I said softly. Timestamp and everything. You took your bracelet off, walked to the kitchen, dropped it in my bag while I was busy with the caterers, then came back out here and started your little performance. I don't know what you're talking about, she whispered, but her voice shook. I smiled. Not a kind smile. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell everyone you found your bracelet, that it had fallen behind the gift table, that this was all a silly mistake, and I'm going to accept your apology graciously. And if I don't, then I show the footage to everyone here, including Brandon, including Mr. Jameson, who I imagine has strong opinions about integrity. I paused. Your choice. Claire's face went white. I didn't show the footage, not yet. I simply said, I'll wait for the right moment, because I'd learned something important. I have seen it. Patience is a weapon. Claire stumbled through an apology to the gathered guests, something about the bracelet falling behind the gift table after, how silly she'd been to panic. Her voice was hollow, unconvincing, but people accepted it because they wanted to. Drama resolved, crisis averted, back to champagne and celebration. I watched her avoid my eyes for the rest of the evening, watched her cling to Brandon's arm, like it might anchor her to something solid. The party finally wound down around 11. I collected the last of the glasses, wiped down tables, stacked chairs, while everyone else filtered inside, laughing and relaxed. My back ached, my feet screamed. But more than the physical exhaustion, I felt something else. A clarity. A cold, sharp understanding that had been building all day and had crystallized in that moment with Claire. I was done being invisible. Done being the family doormat. Done hoping that if I just worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, diminished myself enough, they might finally see my worth. I retreated to the basement room just after midnight. The house above me was finally quiet. I could hear the old pipes creaking, the furnace humming, the washing machine's eternal presence in the corner. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed and pulled out my grandmother's 2 envelopes, from where I'd hidden them in my suitcase. My hand shook as I held them. The first envelope, the one that read, "Open when you need strength," felt heavier than paper should feel. I slid my finger under the seal and carefully opened it. Inside was a small brass key attached to a tag with a number, Safety Deposit Box 127 First National Bank, and a letter written in my grandmother's elegant script on her personal stationery. I recognised the faint scent of her perfume, still clinging to the paper, and my throat tightened. "My dearest Bray," it began, and I could hear her voice saying my name, the only person who'd ever used that nickname. "If you're reading this, it means you're finally ready to fight, not with fists or shouting, but with truth. And truth, my darling girl, is the sharpest weapon there is." I read on my eyes widening with each line. "Your father wasn't always the man he became. When he was young, his own father crushed every spark of confidence out of him, told him he'd never amount to anything, called him weak, stupid, worthless. Your father spent his whole life trying to prove that man wrong, and in doing so, he became him. The cycle repeated. He saw your brilliance, and it terrified him because it reflected his own inadequacy." My grandmother's words were clinical but compassionate, explaining without excusing. She continued, "For 15 years, I watched him steal credit from subordinates. I watched him build his career on other people's work. I said nothing because I was a coward, and I'm sorry for that. But I did do one thing. I documented it. Every stolen report, every plagiarized proposal, every erased name. It's all in the safety deposit box, including something you don't know about yet." My heart hammered against my ribs. "The Project Phoenix strategy that saved Jameson Corporation. The one you created as Ms. B. Shaw. Your father found your files on your old laptop, the one you left here during Christmas 2018. He copied everything, submitted it under his name to the executive team. He received a commendation, a bonus, a promotion, all for work his daughter did." The room tilted. I gripped the letter with both hands, reading the words again, making sure I'd understood correctly. My father had stolen Project Phoenix, the project that had saved the company, that had cemented my reputation as Miss B. Shaw, that had been entirely my strategy and analysis. He'd taken it, claimed it as his own. "I have the evidence, Brittany, the original files with your digital signature and timestamp, the copies he made, the submission date. All of it. I gathered this not for revenge, but for freedom. Your freedom. Use it, Charlie. Use it when you're strong enough to stand in your own light without needing their approval. This is your battle, darling girl. I can only give you the weapons. I trust you to know when and how to use them." The letter was signed with her name and a final line, "You were always extraordinary. I just wish I'd told you more often. I'm proud of you. Use this for freedom, not revenge." I sat there for a long moment, the letter trembling in my hands, then carefully folded it and retrieved the key. First National Bank was 3 blocks from here. I'd passed it on my drive in. I checked my phone 12:47 a.m. The bank would open at 9. I barely slept. I lay in that narrow bed listening to the house settle planning. At 8:30 a.m., I was showered and dressed, wearing jeans and a simple sweater, looking nothing like wedding staff. I told my mother I needed to run an errand, ignored her irritated comment about hoping you'll be back in time to help with setup, and drove to the bank. The safety deposit box room was quiet and cold. A bank employee led me to box 127, inserted the bank's key alongside my grandmother's, and left me alone in a small private viewing room. I lifted the metal lid. Inside were 3 manila folders, each labelled with years: 2008, 2012, 2013, 2017, 2018, 23. I opened them one by one. Emails from my father's account forwarding other people's work to executives with my analysis attached in the subject line. Reports with names crossed out and his typed in their place. Performance reviews where he claimed credit for projects he'd had nothing to do with. Testimonies from former employees, including one woman who'd been driven out of the company after my father presented her market analysis as his own work. And then the final folder, the one labelled with recent years. Inside, I found printed emails between my father and himself. He'd apparently sent files from my old laptop to his personal email, then to his work email. The chain was clear and damning. Files original created by Brittany M. Shaw at personal.com, forwarded through rshaw at personal.com, ultimately submitted from rshaw at jamesoncorp.com. Project at Phoenix. My entire strategic analysis. My code reviews. My implementation timeline. All submitted under his name 3 days after he'd accessed my old laptop during that Christmas visit. There was even a handwritten note from my grandmother, paperclipped to the top. He came to Christmas dinner 2018. You left your laptop in the guest room. He went upstairs to take a call and was gone for 40 minutes. I checked the laptop afterward. He'd copied your entire Project Phoenix folder to a flash drive. I took screenshots of the access logs. I'm sorry I didn't tell you then. I was afraid of tearing the family apart. I was wrong to stay silent. I sat in that cold little room and cried. Not from sadness, but from rage, pure clarifying rage. He hadn't just dismissed me, hadn't just overlooked me. He'd actively stolen from me. Taken the work I'd done to save his company, claimed it as his own. Built his reputation on my intellect while treating me like hired help at my own brother's wedding. I carefully photographed every document with my phone, uploaded them to secure cloud storage, then placed the originals back in the box. This wasn't something to carry around. This was too important to risk losing. When I returned to my car, I sat in the parking lot for a long time, holding my phone, looking at the digital copies of 15 years of theft. Tomorrow was the wedding. CEO Jameson would be there, the man who'd been desperately searching for Ms. B. Shaw. My father would be there, basking in his reputation built on stolen work. My mother would be there, directing me like staff, Brandon Clare. 200 guests all gathered to celebrate a family that had never included me. I held 15 years of evidence in my hands. Tomorrow at the wedding, the CEO would be there. My father would be there. And I would finally be seen. I woke at dawn on the day of my brother's wedding. Not because I'd slept well, but because I'd barely slept at all. My mind had been racing through scenarios, possibilities, consequences. By the time grey light filtered through the small basement window, I'd made my decision. Not just what I would do, but who I would be when I did it. I showered in the cramped basement bathroom, washing away the invisible daughter I'd been for 35 years. When I emerged, I didn't reach for the staff apron my mother had left hanging on the back of the door. Instead, I opened my suitcase and pulled out the outfit I'd packed, but never expected to wear a tailored charcoal suit, crisp white blouse, and the pearl earrings my grandmother had left me. Professional, polished, powerful. I dressed slowly, deliberately, fastening each button like armour, applied minimal makeup, pulled my hair into a sleek, low bun. When I looked in the small mirror above the bathroom sink, I saw Ms. B. Shaw, looking back. The consultant who'd saved a Fortune 500 company. The strategist CEOs paid 6 figures to consult. Not the overlooked daughter, not the unpaid help, but the woman I'd built myself into despite everything. I climbed the basement stairs at 8:30. The house was already chaos. Florists, arriving caterers, setting up, my mother's voice rising above it all, directing traffic like a general commanding troops. I could hear Claire's nervous laughter from upstairs bridesmaids chattering, the sound of champagne corks popping for mimosas. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself coffee. My mother rushed in, clipboard in hand, stopped short when she saw me. "Brittany, what are you wearing?" Her eyes swept over my suit, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm. "Where's your apron? The guests start arriving in an hour, and we need you to check in the gifts, manage the seating cards, help people find their—" "No," I said simply, taking a sip of coffee. She blinked. "Excuse me." I said no, I won't be working today. "Brittany, this is not the time for one of your moods. Your brother is getting married. We need all hands." "I am a guest?" I interrupted, setting down my coffee cup with deliberate care. "Not staff, not help. A guest, your daughter, Brandon's sister, and I'll be dressed and treated accordingly." My mother's face flushed. "I don't know what's gotten into you, but this is incredibly selfish. After everything we've done for you, giving you a place to stay, including you in this weekend. Including me." I laughed, and the sound was sharp enough to make her flinch. "You listed me as unpaid volunteer staff. You gave me the basement room with the washing machine. You've introduced me to guests as helping out instead of as your daughter. That's not inclusion, Mum. That's erasure." She opened her mouth closed. It opened it again. Before she could formulate a response, I walked past her through the living room where my father was adjusting his tie in the hall mirror. "Brittany," he frowned at my suit. "Shouldn't you be setting up the ceremony chairs?" "No," I said, brushing past him too. I went out the front door, stood on the porch in the morning sunshine, and pulled out my phone. My hands were steady as I scrolled through my contacts to a number I'd saved 3 years ago and never deleted. Margaret Chen, executive assistant to Alexander Jameson. The phone rang twice before she answered. "Margaret Chen, speaking." "Ms. Chen, this is Be Sure." There was a pause, a sharp intake of breath. "Ms. Shaw, we've been trying to reach you for months. Mr. Jameson has been desperate to—" "I know," I said. "I'm sorry for the radio silence, but I need you to deliver a message to Mr. Jameson today, this morning." "Of course, anything." "Tell him that Ms. B. Shaw will meet him at the Shaw-Montgomery wedding at 10 a.m. Tell him I'll be the woman in the charcoal suit. Tell him we have a lot to discuss about Project Phoenix." Another pause, longer this time. "You're at the wedding, the one he's attending this morning?" "I am, and Margaret, tell him to bring his questions about the consultant who saved his company. All of them will be answered today." "I'll tell him immediately," she said, her voice crackling with excitement. "Ms. Shaw, he's going to be thrilled. He's been—" "I know," I said again. 10 a.m. Don't be late." I ended the call and stood there, my heart hammering, but my resolve solid. Behind me, I heard the front door open. I turned to find Brandon standing there, still in his jeans and t-shirt, hours from his tuxedo. He looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw something shift in his expression. "Britt, what's going on? What do you mean? I heard you on the phone, and Mum's inside having a meltdown about you refusing to help, and you're dressed like—" He gestured at my suit. "Like you're going to a board meeting, not a wedding." "Maybe I am," I said, "going to a board meeting." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Does this have something to do with Dad's boss? With that CEO guy?" I met his eyes. My little brother, who'd been given everything I'd been denied, and for the first time I saw uncertainty there. Maybe even guilt. "Yes," I said simply. "Britt, What are you planning? I'm planning to stop being invisible, I said. I'm planning to stop pretending it's okay that this family treats me like hired help. I'm planning to finally show up as who I really am. Who are you? He asked, and there was genuine curiosity in the question, as if he'd never really wondered before. You're about to find out, I said. We all are. He stood there searching my face, and I could see him processing something, connecting dots he'd never bothered to connect before. This is going to be bad, isn't it, for Dad? That depends on your definition of bad, I said. For Dad's reputation built on lies, yes. For the truth, no. Brandon swallowed hard. Maybe he deserves it, he said quietly, almost to himself. Maybe we all do. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. I walked past him, back into the house, past my mother, who tried to hand me a seating chart, past my father, who called my name with irritation in his voice. I walked straight to the basement, collected my phone and the pearls my grandmother had left me, and checked the time. 9:15. Guests would start arriving soon. The ceremony was scheduled for 10:30, with a cocktail hour beforehand. CEO Jameson would arrive early, as executives always did, wanting to greet the host and make their presence known before the crowd descended. I climbed back upstairs one final time and positioned myself near the entrance to the ceremony venue, a elegant hotel ballroom 3 blocks away, where the family had already migrated. I stood in a quiet corner, watching the door, breathing steadily, feeling the weight of my grandmother's pearls at my ears. At exactly 10 a.m., the ceremony hall filled with guests. CEO Jameson entered, his silver hair unmistakable, his posture commanding. He scanned the crowd, clearly looking for someone. For me. I stepped out from the shadows. Our eyes met, and everything changed. For 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours, Alexander Jameson and I simply looked at each other across the elegant ballroom. I saw the exact moment recognition solidified in his eyes, the moment the consultant he'd been hunting for months crystallized into the woman standing before him, in a charcoal suit and her grandmother's pearls. He started walking toward me. My father, ever the attentive employee, spotted his boss immediately and rushed to intercept him, Brandon and Claire in tow. I watched the collision course with a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a play I'd already seen, knowing exactly how each scene would unfold. Mr. Jameson, my father's voice boomed across the space, hearty and desperate to please. Welcome, we're so honoured you could make it. Let me introduce you to the happy couple. This is my son Brandon and his beautiful bride Claire. Brandon extended his hand, his expression carefully composed, though I caught him glancing my direction with something like apprehension. Claire smiled her pageant smile, the one that didn't reach her eyes, especially not after last night. Congratulations to you both, Jameson said with appropriate warmth, shaking hands. But his attention was elsewhere. His eyes kept drifting past them, searching for me in the growing crowd. My father was still talking, words tumbling out in his eagerness to impress. Brandon just completed his MBA from Stanford, and we're so proud. He's got tremendous business instincts, real strategic thinking. I keep telling him he's got a bright future in corporate. Richard and Jameson interrupted gently but firmly. Forgive me, but I believe I see someone I need to speak with. He stepped around my father, who looked confused and slightly offended, and walked directly toward me. The conversation around us began to quiet. People noticed. A CEO doesn't cross a room with that kind of purpose, without attracting attention. I stood my ground, my heart hammering, but my expression calm. When he was 3 feet away, I extended my hand. Mr. Jameson, I said clearly, I'm sorry for all the mystery. He took my hand in both of his grip warm and his face transformed by something close to wonder. Miss, sure, he said, and though his voice was measured, it carried across the now silent space. Is it really you? It's really me, I said. My God. He laughed, shaking his head. Margaret gave me your message this morning, and I thought I'd misunderstood. You're here, you've been here at Richard Shaw's son's wedding. I've been here the whole time, I said. I'm Richard Shaw's daughter. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the ice shifting in people's drinks. Jameson's expression shifted from delight to confusion to dawning comprehension. He looked from me to my father, who had gone very still about 10 feet away, then back to me. His daughter, Jameson repeated slowly. You're Brittany Shaw, Richard's daughter, and you're Miss B. Shaw. I am. The consultant who saved my company 3 years ago, who designed Project Phoenix, who I've been trying to find for 3 months. His voice was rising now, not with anger, but with amazement, and heads were turning throughout the ballroom. You're the strategist who prevented mass layoffs, who restructured our entire logistics operation, who wrote the most brilliant systems analysis I've seen in 30 years. I felt tears prick my eyes, but I blinked them back. Yes, sir. I've been searching for you everywhere, he said, his hand still holding mine as if afraid I might disappear again. I wanted to offer you a position on our board of directors. I wanted to thank you properly. I've been sending emails, making calls, driving my HR department crazy, trying to track you down. He turned to address the room, his voice filling the space. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for interrupting, but I need you to understand something. This woman saved my company. 3,000 jobs, countless families. She did it with brilliance and precision, and then she disappeared before I could even shake her hand. My mother had appeared at my father's elbow. I watched her face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been horror. She gripped my father's arm, her knuckles white. My father himself looked like he'd been struck. His carefully maintained expression of professional pride had crumbled into something raw and panicked. He opened his mouth closed. It opened it again like a fish drowning in air. Richard, Jameson said, turning to him with genuine confusion. Why didn't you tell me your daughter was Ms. B? Sure. I've been pestering you for months about trying to find her through your networks. You never mentioned she was family. My father's face had gone from pale to flushed. You didn't know, I said quietly, but in the absolute silence of the room my voice carried perfectly. He didn't know because I never told him. I used my middle initial instead of my first name. I kept my identity private. But why? Jameson asked, turning back to me. You're extraordinarily talented. Why hide? I looked at my father, at my mother clinging to his arm, at Brandon standing with his mouth slightly open at Claire, who had gone very pale, at the 200 guests who were witnessing this unravelling. Because, I said carefully, I learned a long time ago that my family wasn't interested in my success. So, I built one without them. Jameson's expression shifted again, this time to something that looked like understanding mixed with sadness. I see, he said quietly. Then louder. Well, Ms. Shaw, your secret is out now. And I'm going to say this publicly so everyone here knows you are one of the most brilliant strategic minds I've had the privilege to work with. You saved my company when we were weeks from collapse, and I would be honoured if you would join our board of directors. The room erupted, not in applause exactly, but in a wave of shocked conversation, whispers rippling outward, like stones thrown into still water. I heard fragments. That's Richard's daughter, the one who was setting up chairs yesterday. She saved Jameson Corporation. I thought she was unemployed. Through it all, I kept my eyes on my father, watched him process what this meant. That his daughter, the one he'd rejected from his own department, the one he'd treated like staff at his son's wedding, was the consultant his CEO had been desperately seeking. The woman who'd saved the company. The brilliant strategist he'd spent months praising to colleagues without knowing her identity. My mother's voice cut through the noise, shrill with disbelief. Richard, she said loud enough for nearby guests to hear, you told me she worked at a coffee shop. The room fell into complete silence. 200 guests stared. My father's wineglass trembled in his hand. My mother whispered, Richard, you told me she worked at a coffee shop. The moment my mother's words landed, the careful composure my father had been desperately maintaining shattered. His face went through a series of transformations: shock, embarrassment, and finally, a forced smile that fooled no one. He tried to laugh, to wave it off as if my mother had made a joke, but the sound came out strangled and wrong. Before he could speak, Aunt Carol materialized at my elbow, champagne in hand, her face bright with excitement. "Brittany, I had no idea. Saved an entire company." "My goodness, why didn't you say anything?" Then, Uncle Jim, my father's golf buddy from yesterday, the one my father had introduced me to as helping out. His wife Barbara was with him, and her expression had shifted from yesterday's polite dismissal to something like embarrassment. "We had no idea who you were," she said, touching my arm. "When Richard said you were helping with the wedding, we thought..." "You thought I was staff," I said quietly, "because that's what he told you." More relatives crowded around people who'd known me since childhood, suddenly remembering I existed. Cousin Jennifer wanted to know where I'd gone to school. Great Aunt Martha asked about my consulting business. Everyone wanted to congratulate me, to associate themselves with my sudden elevation from invisible to important. Through the crowd, I could see my father being backed into a corner by guests asking questions he couldn't answer. "Richard, your daughter saved Jameson Corporation. Why didn't you mention she was in technology? She must have gotten her brilliance from you." Each question was a small knife cutting away at the facade he'd built. I watched him try to smile, try to accept the compliments, as if he'd had anything to do with my success, but the effort was visibly costing him. Sweat had appeared on his forehead. His tie seemed too tight. Then Brandon cut through the crowd. His face was set in an expression I'd never seen before, something hard and determined. He walked straight to our parents, ignoring the guests around them, and said in a voice that carried, "We need to talk. Now." My father tried to wave him off. "Son, this isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," Brandon said. He grabbed both parents by the arm and physically steered them toward a quiet corner near the entrance, away from the main crowd. I was too far to hear everything, but I saw Brandon's face as he spoke, saw the way my mother's hand flew to her mouth, saw my father's shoulders slump. I caught fragments as I moved closer. "Lied to me about her. All these years. Why would you..." My mother tried to put a hand on Brandon's arm, tried to soothe him, but he shook her off. "Don't," he said loud enough that I heard clearly. "Don't tell me it was complicated. Don't tell me you had your reasons. She's my sister, and you made me complicit in treating her like she didn't matter." Claire appeared then, her face pale and tight. She wasn't looking at Brandon or his parents. She was looking at me with something close to panic in her eyes. I understood immediately. If I could reveal myself as Miss B. Shaw, what else might I reveal? The bracelet incident, perhaps. The frame-up she'd attempted. In front of all these guests, in front of Brandon's family, in front of everyone who mattered to her socially. She caught my eye across the room, and I saw the plea there, the desperation. I simply looked away. Let her sit with that fear for a while. CEO Jameson had been watching the family drama unfold with an expression of growing concern. He approached me gently, guiding me away from the crowd that had formed around me toward a quieter section of the ballroom near the windows. "Ms. Shaw," he said quietly, and his voice was kind, but serious. "I feel like I've walked into the middle of something much larger than a professional connection. Would you mind explaining what's really happening here?" I looked at him, this powerful man who'd been searching for me for months, who'd just offered me a board position in front of 200 people, and decided he deserved honesty. "What do you want to know?" "Let's start with why you were dressed as staff yesterday. I saw you serving wine at the rehearsal dinner. Margaret told me this morning that you called her before the wedding. Were you working this event?" "Working as in paid, no. Working as in, my family designated me as unpaid help while keeping the guest rooms for people who actually mattered to them." "Yes." His face hardened. "Richard told you to work as art staff at your own brother's wedding." He didn't have to tell me. My mother handed me an apron. It was simply expected. It's always been expected. I paused, then added, I spent yesterday setting up chairs, serving drinks, and being introduced to your colleagues as helping out rather than as family. Jameson's jaw tightened. And your father said nothing. My father rejected my job application to your company 7 years ago, I said flatly. He wrote that I was not a good culture fit for his department. He has spent my entire life ensuring I remained invisible. Yesterday was just more of the same. My God, Jameson breathed. He looked toward where my father stood, still cornered by Brandon, and something shifted in his expression. He didn't know you were Ms. B. Sure did he? He had no idea his own daughter was the consultant he'd been working with for months after Project Phoenix. No, I said. He didn't know, because I made sure he wouldn't. I changed my professional name, kept my identity anonymous, worked only through digital channels. I built a career in the shadows because the light was never meant for me in this family. Jameson was quiet for a long moment, processing. Then he looked at me with something that might have been anger on my behalf. Why reveal yourself now? Why not continue as you were? Because I needed to see something, I said. I needed to see if my family could love me without knowing my worth, if they could treat me with basic respect when they thought I was nothing special. I gestured around the ballroom at the crowd still buzzing with conversation, at my parents huddled with Brandon, at Claire, hovering nervously nearby. Now I have my answer. I'm sorry, Jameson said, and he meant it. No one should have to test their family's love like that. No, I agreed. They shouldn't. He started to say something else, then stopped, his eyes caught by something. I followed his gaze and realised he was looking at my bag where a corner of manila folder peeked out. The folder from my grandmother's safety deposit box. What's that? He asked. I looked at him, this man who valued truth and excellence, who'd built a company on integrity, who'd spent months searching for a consultant because he believed in giving credit where it was due. I made a decision. I looked CEO in the eye and said, I needed to see if my family could love me without knowing my worth. Now I have my answer. Then I opened my bag and pulled out grandmother's folder. Jameson's eyes dropped to the folder in my hands, then back to my face. What is that? Before I could answer, the wedding coordinator appeared at the front of the ballroom, her voice cutting through the chaos with professional brightness. Ladies and gentlemen, if we could ask everyone to begin taking their seats, the ceremony will begin in just a few moments. But first, tradition calls for a few words from the father of the groom. The crowd began to settle, conversations dying down as people moved toward their assigned seats. My father stood frozen near the family section, his face still flushed, clearly unprepared for this moment. The coordinator was gesturing to him encouragingly, smiling as if nothing unusual had just happened. He walked slowly to the microphone stand that had been set up near the altar, each step looking like it cost him something. The folder felt heavy in my hands. I could end this right now. I could walk up there and lay out every piece of evidence in front of everyone. But something held me back. Maybe it was the last shred of the girl who'd once loved her father, who'd once believed he might change. Maybe it was just wanting to hear what he'd say. My father cleared his throat, gripping the microphone stand like it might steady him. Thank you all for coming, he began, his voice rough. Today is a celebration of my son, Brandon, and his bride, Claire. I'm so proud of Brandon. He's grown into a fine young man, accomplished, intelligent, ready to take on the world. The words were rote practice, the same speech he'd probably planned weeks ago. But now they landed differently in the room. People shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed. My father's knuckles were white on the microphone stand. CEO Jameson, still standing beside me, said quietly but clearly enough to be heard by those nearby, Actually, I think we'd all love to hear from Brittany Shaw as well, the woman of the hour. Heads turned. My father's eyes snapped to Jameson, then to me, and I saw panic flash across his face. The wedding coordinator looked confused, but nodded enthusiastically. "What a wonderful idea, Ms. Shaw. Would you like to say a few words?" The silence that followed was expectant charged. I looked at the folder in my hands, then set it carefully on a nearby table. Not yet. Not like this. I walked to the microphone, my heels clicking on the polished floor, each step feeling both terrifying and inevitable. My father stepped aside, and for a brief moment we were close enough that I could smell his cologne, could see the fine lines of stress around his eyes. "Brittany," he whispered, "please don't." But I was already at the microphone looking out at 200 faces, some curious, some confused, some genuinely interested in what I might say. I saw Brandon in the front row, his expression unreadable. Claire beside him, pale and tense. My mother, in her mother of the groom dress, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. I took a breath and began. "Thank you all for being here today," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "This is my brother's wedding, and it should be a day of celebration, of love, of family, and I am genuinely happy for Brandon and Claire as they start this new chapter." I paused, gathering my thoughts, feeling the weight of what I was about to say. But I want to talk for a moment about something that's been on my mind, about worth, about visibility, about what it means to be seen. The room was absolutely still. For most of my life, I've been invisible in my own family, not because I wasn't accomplished, not because I wasn't trying, but because my accomplishments didn't fit the narrative they wanted to tell. I learned early that success, when it comes from the wrong person, can be threatening rather than celebrated. "Shoan," I saw my father flinch, saw my mother's hand grip her tissue tighter. So I built a life in the shadows. I became successful, quietly, privately, without fanfare or family dinners or proud father speeches. I saved a Fortune 500 company under a different name because I knew that if my family saw what I'd accomplished, it would somehow be diminished or ignored or stolen. The word stolen hung in the air. My father's face had gone grey. "CEO Jameson?" I turned to look at him. "Thank you. Thank you for seeing my work, not my name. Thank you for valuing excellence regardless of who it came from. Thank you for searching for months to find someone whose work spoke louder than their identity. That's integrity. That's leadership." Jameson nodded, his expression solemn and respectful. I turned to Brandon. "And Brandon, I want you to know I'm proud of you. Genuinely proud. Not because of your MBA or your accomplishments, but because a few minutes ago you did something brave. You questioned what you'd been told. You demanded truth from people you love. That takes courage." Brandon's eyes were bright with unshed tears. He nodded once, sharp and quick. Then I addressed the room at large, my voice gaining strength. "To everyone here, I want to say something important. Your worth is not negotiable. It doesn't depend on who recognizes it. It doesn't require permission or validation from people who should love you but don't know how. You are valuable because you exist, because you try, because you create and build and persist." I could feel emotion rising in my throat, but I pushed through it. Never let anyone make you feel small. Not your family, not your colleagues, not the voices in your head that sound like people who couldn't see you. You are not too much or too little. You are not overqualified or underappreciated. You are exactly who you need to be, and that is enough. My voice broke slightly on the last word. The room was silent for a heartbeat, then two, and then someone in the back started clapping. The sound built, spreading through the ballroom like a wave. People stood. The applause grew louder, genuine and warm and overwhelming. I stood there, tears streaming down my face, now feeling both broken and whole, seen, finally, completely seen. As the applause continued, I stepped away from the microphone. My father moved toward me, his hand outstretched, his face desperate. "Brittany, we need to talk," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Please, let me explain." but I walked past him to the table where I'd set the folder. I picked it up, felt its weight, and turned back to him. The room was still buzzing, people returning to their seats, conversations starting up again. "No, Dad," I said loud enough for those nearby to hear. "You need to listen." The room erupted in applause. But as I stepped down, Father blocked my path. "Brittany, we need to talk." I placed Grandmother's folder on the table. "No, Dad, you need to listen." My father stared at the folder on the table, then at me, and I watched the blood drain from his face. He knew. Somehow, in that moment, he knew exactly what that folder contained. "Brittany, please," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Not here. Not now. This is your brother's wedding. You made it about this, I said quietly. The moment you handed me a staff apron, the moment you introduced me as helping out instead of your daughter. You made this wedding about showing everyone what you value and what you don't. So yes, Dad, here, now." CEO Jameson had moved closer, drawn by the tension radiating from our exchange. "Ms. Shaw," he said carefully, "is everything all right?" I picked up the folder and turned to him. "Mr. Jameson, I need to show you something. Privately, if possible." My father's hand shot out, gripping my arm. "Brittany, don't do this. Please, I'm begging you." I looked down at his hand on my arm, then up at his face. I'd never seen him beg for anything in his life. Never seen him vulnerable, desperate, stripped of the armour of authority he wore like a second skin. For a moment, I almost wavered, almost let the little girl who'd once loved him unconditionally soften my resolve. But then I remembered the staff schedule with my name ranked below the parking attendant, remembered the family photo they'd cropped at me out of, remembered 15 years of stolen work, stolen credit, stolen dignity. I pulled my arm free. "Let go of me." Jameson's expression had shifted from concern to something harder. "Richard, I think you should step back." My father released me, his hand falling to his side. He looked from me to Jameson and back again, calculating, trying to find an angle, a way out. But there was none. We both knew it. "Mr. Jameson," I said, "there's a private room off the main ballroom. The bride's preparation room. Can we speak there for a moment?" "Of course." He gestured for me to lead the way, then looked at my father. "Richard, I think you should come as well." We walked in silence, 3 people moving through a ballroom full of confused wedding guests. I felt eyes following us, heard the whispers starting up again. My mother tried to stand to follow, but Brandon put a hand on her arm, keeping her seated. Good. This wasn't for her. Not yet. The bride's preparation room was elegant and empty, with the long mirror velvet couches and soft lighting designed to make anxious brides feel calm. I closed the door behind us and the sounds of the ballroom faded to a muted hum. Jameson looked at me expectantly. My father stood by the door as if contemplating escape. I opened the folder and spread the contents across the vanity counter. Printed emails, metadata reports, file transfer logs, access records. 15 years of evidence organised chronologically, labelled clearly. My grandmother's meticulous documentation. "What is this?" as Jameson asked, moving closer. "This is proof that my father has been stealing credit for other people's work for 15 years. I said, my voice steady despite the hammering of my heart. "Including mine." My father made a sound like he'd been punched. "Brittany, you don't understand." "Then explain it to him," I said, pointing at Jameson. "Explain this." I pulled out a specific set of documents, the ones I'd examined most carefully at the bank. These are the original Project Phoenix files, the strategy document, the implementation timeline, the systems analysis. All created by me under the file name conventions I always used, project name BM Shaw date. I pointed to the metadata visible in the printouts. Created by Brittany M. Shaw at personal.com. Saved multiple times over a 2-week period in late 2018, early 2019. Jameson leaned in, his reading glasses appearing from his pocket. He studied the documents carefully. These files. I continued pulling out another set, show access logs from my old laptop, the one I left at my parents' house during Christmas 2018. My father accessed this laptop on December 27th, copied the entire Project Phoenix folder to a flash drive. My grandmother documented it. She took screenshots. My father had gone grey. I didn't know what it was, he said weakly. I was just looking at your files, seeing what you were working on. And then, I continued, my voice getting harder. 3 days later, these same files were submitted to Jameson Corporation's executive team. Same content, same structure, same analysis, but with a different name on them. I laid out the final document. The submission email from my father's work account. Subject line, Proposed Solution for Logistics Crisis, Richard Shaw. Attached Project Phoenix with his name on every page where mine had been. Jameson's face had transformed. The warmth, the kindness, the mentorship I'd seen in his eyes was gone, replaced by something cold and judicial. He picked up document after document, examining timestamps, comparing files following the paper trail my grandmother had so carefully preserved. Richard, he said finally, not looking up from the papers, is this true? The silence stretched. I could hear my father breathing quick and shallow, could hear the muted sounds of the wedding beyond the door, guests wondering where everyone had gone. I was desperate, my father said, and his voice cracked. My performance reviews were terrible. I was on the verge of being demoted. I had a mortgage, college tuition for Brandon bills piling up. And there it was, this brilliant solution, just sitting on her laptop. So you stole it, Jameson said flatly. I borrowed it, my father protested weakly. I was going to tell her to give her credit eventually, but then it worked so well, and I got promoted and there was never a good time. You stole your daughter's work, Jameson interrupted, his voice sharp as broken glass. You submitted it under your own name. You accepted a commendation for it, a bonus, a promotion. You built the last 3 years of your career on work she did. I didn't know she'd done it professionally, my father said, grasping at straws. I didn't know she was Ms. B. Shaw. I thought it was just some freelance project, something she was playing around with. Does that make it better? I asked quietly. That you thought my work was insignificant enough to steal? He had no answer for that. Jameson was still examining the documents, his jaw tight. This is more than Project Phoenix, he said, pointing to the earlier folders. This goes back years. Other employees' work, other stolen projects. I know, I said. My grandmother documented all of it. She was going to confront him herself, but she died before she could. She left it for me instead. Jameson looked at my father with something close to disgust. Richard, I trusted you. I promoted you. I've defended you to the board. And all this time you've been building your reputation on other people's brilliance. I made mistakes, my father said, his voice desperate now. But I've also done good work. I've contributed. What contributions? Jameson snapped. How do I know what's yours and what you've stolen? How does anyone know? The question hung in the air, unanswerable. Jameson stood up, drawing himself to his full height. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of final judgment. Richard Shaw, you are suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation. You will report to HR Monday morning at 9 a.m. You will surrender your laptop, your phone, your access cards. You will not contact anyone at the company, except through HR and legal counsel. Do you understand? My father actually crumpled his knees, buckling until he caught himself against the wall. Please, he whispered. My career, my reputation, my pension. I have 25 years with this company. Built on lies, Jameson said coldly. You should have thought about that before you stole from your own daughter. He turned to me, his expression softening slightly. Ms. Shaw, I apologize. If I'd known, if anyone had known. You couldn't have known, I said quietly. I made sure of that. Jameson nodded, gathering up the documents carefully. I'll need to take these. For the investigation. We'll need your full statement, a detailed accounting of everything. The board will want answers. I understand. He moved toward the door, then paused. The wedding. Should we? The wedding is over, I said, looking at my father slumped against the wall, broken and small. But the real reckoning has just begun. His CEO stood up. Richard Shaw, you are suspended, effective immediately. Report to HR Monday morning. My father crumpled into his chair. The wedding was over. But the real reckoning had just begun. We emerged from that room into a ballroom that had transformed from celebration to wake. The festive energy had drained away, replaced by awkward silence and furtive whispers. Guests clustered in small groups, pretending to look at their phones or examine the floral arrangements, while clearly watching us. My father walked like a man heading to his execution, shoulders hunched, face ashen. Jameson followed the folder tucked under his arm, like evidence at a trial. I came last, and I felt the weight of 200 pairs of eyes tracking my movement. Brandon was standing near the altar, still in his tuxedo, his face a mask of confusion and dawning horror. Claire stood beside him, but there was distance between them now, a gap of several inches that spoke volumes. She was whispering urgently to him, her hand on his arm, but he wasn't responding, wasn't looking at her. As we approached, Claire's whisper grew louder, more desperate. Brandon, we need to talk. Privately. Now. He finally looked at her, and I saw something I'd never seen in my brother's face before. Disgust. You knew, didn't you? He said, his voice carrying in the silent room. You knew what they were planning. The staff apron, the basement room, all of it. Claire's face went pale. I didn't know about your father's, about the work thing. I swear I didn't know that. But you knew about Brittany, Brandon said. You knew how they were treating her and you went along with it. How you made it worse. He turned to me, his eyes red-rimmed. The bracelet. That was real, wasn't it? She really did plant it in your bag. I nodded, once silent. Claire grabbed his arm harder. Brandon, please. I made a mistake. Your mother asked me to help keep things running smoothly, and I took it too far. But we can get past this. We can still... Still what? Brandon interrupted, pulling his arm free. Still, get married today, after all this. He gestured around the ballroom at the chaos, at our father, who'd collapsed into a chair near the family section, at the guests, who were now openly staring. You wanted to marry into this family. Well, congratulations. You just saw what we really are. Brandon, don't do this. Claire's voice rose, taking on a pleading edge I'd never heard from her before. Don't throw away what we have because your family is dysfunctional. We can work through this. Work through what? Brandon's voice broke. Through the fact that you were paid to humiliate my sister. Through watching my father get exposed as a fraud. Through realizing my whole family is built on lies. He pulled off his boutonniere and set it on a nearby table with careful precision. I can't do this, Claire. Not today. Maybe not ever. You're calling off our wedding. Her voice was shrill now, disbelieving. Because of her. She pointed at me, and the venom in that gesture made several guests gasp. No, Brandon said quietly. Because of me. Because I've been complicit in all of this, and I need to figure out who I am when I'm not performing for people who can't see past their own damage. He looked at me. I'm sorry, Britt. For everything. For all of it. Then he walked away out of the ballroom, still in his tuxedo, leaving Claire standing alone in her place at the altar. She stood there for a long moment, trembling, her perfect composure finally cracking. Then she turned to her mother, who'd been sitting rigid in the front row throughout this entire debacle. "Mum, we need to go, now." Within 15 minutes, Claire and her entire family had gathered their things and left a convoy of expensive cars pulling away from the hotel. The wedding that had been planned for a year, that had cost tens of thousands of dollars, dissolved like sugar in rain. Guests began to leave too quietly, uncomfortably unsure of the etiquette for a wedding that had imploded so spectacularly. Some offered awkward condolences to my mother as they passed. Most just slipped away grateful to escape. My father sat in his chair, phone in his hand, and I watched as the calls started coming in. I was too far away to hear the conversations, but I could see his face with each one. The first call made him flinch. The second made him close his eyes. By the third, his hands were shaking. Later, I learned what those calls contained. HR confirming his suspension and demanding his company laptop and credentials by end of business Monday. The bank flagging his account because his direct deposit authorization had been suspended. Former colleagues, people he'd worked with for years, sending texts that ranged from disbelief to outright hostility. Someone had already leaked something to the company's internal message boards. The rumours were spreading. My mother sat beside him, her hand on his arm, her face blank with shock. She hadn't cried, hadn't spoken, just sat there staring at nothing as her carefully constructed world collapsed around her. I stood near the windows watching all of this unfold and felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction, just a vast, echoing emptiness where something should have been. I'd spent weeks imagining this moment, what it would feel like to finally be vindicated, to watch my father face consequences, to be seen and valued and recognised. I hadn't imagined it would feel like ashes. CEO Jameson found me there as the last guest trickled out. "Ms. Shaw," he said quietly, "I'm heading back to the city, but I wanted you to know the legal team will need to interview you, formally. We'll need detailed statements, timeline documentation, everything." "I understand," I said. "This is going to be a long process," he continued. "Messy. There will be depositions, possibly legal action. The board is already scheduling an emergency meeting." He paused. "Are you prepared for that?" "I don't know," I answered honestly. I thought I was, but now... Second thoughts. "Not about the truth," I said. "Just about the cost of it." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Truth is expensive, but lies cost more in the end. You did the right thing, even if it doesn't feel like it right now." "Did I?" I gestured at the empty ballroom, at my parents sitting alone in the ruins of their son's wedding day. "Look what I've destroyed." "You didn't destroy this," Jameson said firmly. "Your father did. You just stopped pretending the destruction wasn't there." He handed me a business card. "My personal cell phone is on the back. Call me if you need anything. And Miss Shaw." "Miss Shaw, that board position still stands when you're ready." He left. The caterers began quietly dismantling the reception setup that would never be used. The florist collected the elaborate arrangements. The photographer packed up equipment, having documented the strangest wedding day of her career. I retreated to the basement room as evening fell, exhausted, in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. I lay on the narrow bed, still in my charcoal suit, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house above me settle into silence. Around 9 o'clock, I heard footsteps on the basement stairs. A soft knock at my door. "Brittany?" My mother's voice quiet and careful. I opened the door. She stood there in her mother of the groom dress, still perfectly styled makeup, intact, looking like she'd just come from a party instead of a disaster. But her eyes were different. Hollow. She didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't yell or accuse or defend. She just looked at me for a long moment and asked, "Are you happy now?" I opened my mouth to answer. To say yes, to say I'd gotten what I deserved, what I'd worked for, what I'd earned. To say that justice had been served and truth had prevailed and everything had worked out exactly as it should. But I couldn't, because standing there in my basement room, looking at my mother's devastated face, feeling the weight of a family torn apart by truths that could never be taken back, I realized something terrible. That night, Mother knocked on my door. She didn't cry, didn't beg, just asked, "Are you happy now?" I couldn't answer, because I wasn't. My mother stood in the doorway waiting for an answer I couldn't give. The silence stretched between us thick and uncomfortable. Finally, she stepped into the room without invitation and closed the door behind her. "May I sit?" she asked, gesturing to the edge of my bed. I moved my legs to make space, too tired to refuse. She sat carefully smoothing her dress, and for a moment we were just two women in a basement room. The space between us measured in inches, but feeling like miles. "I need to tell you something," she said finally, her voice low and controlled. "Before you hear it from someone else. Before Claire tells Brandon or Brandon tells you, or it comes out in whatever legal nightmare your father is about to face." My stomach tightened. "What?" She reached into her small evening bag and pulled out her phone. Her hands, I noticed, were trembling slightly as she unlocked it and began scrolling through messages. 3 months ago, she began, not looking at me. When Claire and Brandon got engaged, I took her to lunch. Just the two of us. Future mother-in-law and daughter-in-law bonding. She found what she was looking for and held the phone out to me. A text conversation with Claire. I took the phone, my hands suddenly cold. The first message was from my mother, dated 3 months ago. "Claire, thank you for lunch today. I wanted to follow up on what we discussed. I am prepared to offer you $10,000 to help ensure the wedding weekend goes smoothly, specifically regarding Brittany." Claire's response: "I'm not sure I understand what you're asking me to do." My mother: "Nothing dramatic. Just keep her occupied. Make sure she stays busy with set-up tasks. Don't let her engage with important guests, especially Richard's colleagues from Jameson Corp. She can be difficult, attention-seeking. I need this weekend to be about Brandon, and you, not about Brittany making everything about herself." I felt sick. I kept reading. "Claire, you want me to keep your daughter away from your husband's work people. My mother, I want you to help me maintain appropriate boundaries. Brittany has a tendency to overshare about her career when she meets new people. It's embarrassing. She exaggerates her accomplishments. I don't want her telling tall tales to Richard's CEO and making our family look foolish." The conversation continued, my mother outlining exactly how she wanted Claire to manage me. The staff apron, the task lists, the subtle social exclusions, and, at the end, confirmation of a $10,000 wire transfer. I handed the phone back, unable to look at her. "You paid her to humiliate me." "I paid her to manage a difficult situation." My mother corrected, her voice tight. "I knew you'd come to this wedding with your feelings hurt, wanting attention, wanting recognition. I couldn't have you approaching Alexander Jameson and spinning stories about being some kind of technology expert. Do you have any idea how that would have looked?" "Stories," I repeated flatly. "You thought I was lying about my career." "I thought you were exaggerating," she said. "You do freelance work, Brittany. That's fine. That's respectable. But the way you talk about it sometimes, as if you're some kind of corporate consultant, as if you've saved companies." She stopped, seeming to realize mid-sentence how that sounded now. "I didn't know," she finished weakly. "I didn't know it was true." "You didn't want to know," I said, my voice rising. "You wanted me to be small and quiet and unimportant because that fit your narrative. That fit the story you and Dad told yourselves about your perfect family. That's not fair." "Fair." I laughed, and the sound was harsh enough to make her flinch. "You paid someone $10,000 to keep me away from your husband's boss because you were terrified I might be exactly who I said I was. What's not fair about that statement?" My mother's composure was cracking, her hands twisted in her lap, crushing the fabric of her dress. "I was trying to protect you," she said, and now there was desperation in her voice. I was trying to protect all of us. If Jameson had figured out who you were, if he'd realised you were Miss Shaw, everything would have collapsed. Your father's career, our financial security, this family's reputation. You knew... I interrupted, the realisation hitting me like ice water. You knew Dad had stolen my work. She didn't answer immediately, and that silence was answer enough. How long? I demanded. How long have you known? I suspected, she said carefully. After Christmas 2018, your grandmother mentioned to me that Richard had been on your laptop. She was upset about it, thought he'd violated your privacy. And then a few months later, he got that big promotion for the Project Phoenix work, and I just... She trailed off. You knew, I said again, my voice hollow. You've known for 3 years that Dad built his career on work I did, and you said nothing. You did nothing. You paid someone to humiliate me to protect his lie. I was trying to keep this family together. Her voice broke, finally emotion spilling through the careful control. Do you think I liked what your father became? Do you think I enjoyed watching him tear you down, watching him pour all his love and pride into Brandon while treating you like an afterthought? But what was I supposed to do? Divorce him, at my age, with no career, no income, watch him lose his job and drag us all down with him? You were supposed to protect me, I said, my own voice breaking now. You were supposed to be my mother. That came before being his wife, before being Brandon's mother, before protecting the family reputation or the bank account or any of it. You were supposed to choose me. At least once, just once. Tears were streaming down her face now, cutting through her makeup in dark tracks. I did choose you, in my own way. I kept your awards. I saved every article, every achievement. I was proud of you, Brittany. I just couldn't show it, because every time I did, your father would get angry, would feel threatened, would what? Hit you, her. No, she said quickly. Never that, but he'd withdraw. He'd punish me with silence, with coldness. He'd take it out on you even more. So I learned to stay quiet, to manage him, to keep the peace. By sacrificing me to keep the peace, I said, by making me invisible so he wouldn't feel threatened, by paying Claire $10,000 to ensure I stayed in my place at my own brother's wedding. She had no answer for that. She sat there, tears running down her face, her hands shaking, looking suddenly old and fragile in a way I'd never seen before. Do you know what the worst part is? I asked, my voice quiet, now drained of anger, filled only with exhaustion. It's not that you chose Dad over me. It's that you chose his comfort over my humanity. You turned me into a problem to be managed, an embarrassment to be hidden, a threat to be neutralized. Your own daughter. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know it's not enough, but I'm sorry. Sorry for what? I asked. For 35 years of making me feel worthless. For teaching me that my accomplishments were embarrassments. For hiring someone to humiliate me. For enabling a man who stole from his own child. Which part are you sorry for, Mum? Because I need you to be specific. She opened her mouth and closed. It opened it again. No words came. There were no words that could bridge the chasm between us. No apology that could undo what had been done. I looked at my mother. The woman who birthed me, raised me, and paid someone to humiliate me. The woman who'd chosen comfort over courage, complicity over protection, a lie over her own daughter. Get out, I whispered. Brittany, please. Get out of my room. She stood slowly wiping at her face, leaving dark smears of mascara across her cheeks. At the door, she turned back one more time. I do love you, she said. I know you don't believe that now, but I do. Love isn't enough, I said. It never was. She left, closing the door softly behind her. I heard her footsteps on the stairs, slow and heavy, heard the house settle back into silence. And then, finally, I cried. Not the angry tears I'd held back during my speech, not the bitter tears of vindication. These were different. These were grief, pure overwhelming grief for the mother I'd needed and never had, for the childhood I'd deserved but been denied, for the family that could have been but never was. I looked at my mother, the woman who birthed me, raised me, and paid someone to humiliate me. "Get out," I whispered. "Get out of my room." She left, and I cried for the mother I'd never had. I left my parents' house the next morning without saying goodbye. My mother was in the kitchen, staring at cold coffee. My father was presumably still sleeping or hiding or whatever men do when their entire lives implode. I packed my bag, loaded my car, and drove away while the sun was still low on the horizon. The week that followed was a blur of conference rooms and legal documents and questions asked by people in expensive suits. Jameson Corporation's investigation moved with the methodical efficiency of a company that took fraud seriously, especially when it involved a senior manager and reached back 15 years. Monday morning, I received a call from Margaret Chen, CEO Jameson's assistant. "Ms. Shaw, Mr. Jameson would like to schedule your formal interview with HR and legal counsel. Would Wednesday at 10 work for you?" I agreed, and she emailed me a detailed list of what to bring. Any documentation I had, timeline of events, contact information for witnesses, copies of my original work files if they still existed. Tuesday I learned that Brandon had also been contacted. He called me from his apartment, his voice hollow. "They want to interview me about what I knew, what I saw growing up, about Dad's work habits about you." He paused. "I told them I'd cooperate fully. Is that okay?" "It's more than okay," I said. "It's right." "Claire's been calling," he added. "I'm not answering. I don't know what to say to her." "You don't have to say anything yet." "The wedding deposits are all non-refundable. Mom's freaking out about the money. Dad's freaking out about everything." Another pause. "Are you okay, Britt?" The question surprised me. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "Are you—" "No," he said, "but I think maybe that's appropriate. Maybe we shouldn't be okay right now." Wednesday, I sat in a conference room on the 14th floor of Jameson Corporation headquarters. 2 HR representatives, 1 lawyer, and CEO Jameson himself. They recorded everything. Asked me to walk through the entire history, starting with my rejected application in 2018. I told them about finding my Project Phoenix files on my father's submitted work, about my grandmother's documentation, about the pattern of theft from other employees that stretched back over a decade. They took notes, asked clarifying questions, requested specific dates and details. "Ms. Shaw," the lawyer said at one point, "you understand that your testimony forms the basis of potential termination for cause and possibly civil action for intellectual property theft and fraud." "I understand. And you're prepared to stand by this testimony, even knowing the consequences for your father?" I looked at Jameson, who'd been mostly quiet, letting his team lead. He met my eyes with an expression that was impossible to read. "I'm prepared to tell the truth," I said. "Whatever comes from that is his responsibility, not mine." Thursday and Friday, they interviewed former employees. I learned later that 3 people came forward with their own stories of work, stolen credit, taking careers damaged by my father's plagiarism. One woman had left the company entirely after my father presented her market analysis as his own, and she couldn't prove otherwise. She'd kept emails, though. Backup files, evidence that corroborated everything my grandmother had documented. By Friday evening, the case against my father was overwhelming and undeniable. Saturday, I tried to return to normal life. Grocery shopping, laundry, answering emails from clients who had no idea their consultant had just blown up her family. But everything felt surreal, like I was moving through water, like nothing was quite solid anymore. Sunday, CEO Jameson called me personally. "Ms. Shaw, I wanted to update you before the week starts. The investigation is essentially complete. We have more than sufficient evidence to terminate your father for cause. I see, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. But I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. He paused, and I heard papers rustling in the background. We have grounds for termination. We also have grounds for a civil lawsuit, recovery of bonuses he received for stolen work damages, for fraud, possibly even criminal referral for intellectual property theft. The legal team is recommending we pursue everything. My stomach tightened. And I'm asking you what you want, he said simply, because while this is a company matter, you're the primary victim. Your work, your career, your dignity. So I'm asking, how far do you want this to go? I sat down on my couch, the phone pressed to my ear, and realised I had no idea how to answer. Can I think about it? Of course, take the weekend. But Brittany, he'd never used my first name before. This is about more than revenge or justice. This is about who you want to be when this is over. There's no wrong answer, but make sure it's your answer, not what you think you should want. We hung up. I sat there as evening turned to night, thinking about justice and mercy, about cycles of harm and cycles of healing, about whether destroying my father completely would make me feel better or just make me like him. I thought about my grandmother's note. Use this for freedom, not revenge. But what was the difference? Where was the line between holding someone accountable and becoming cruel, between seeking justice and seeking destruction? Monday morning. I still hadn't decided. I made coffee, opened my laptop to try to work, stared at the screen without seeing it. Tuesday. I drafted 3 different emails to Jameson each with a different answer and sent none of them. Wednesday. Day 7 of the investigation. I was sitting at my kitchen table when my phone buzzed with a notification. An email from Jameson Corporation's legal team CC'd to me, my father and his lawyer. Reinvestigation findings by Richard Shaw. I opened it with shaking hands. Official language. Formal structure, but the message was clear. Evidence supports termination for cause. Preliminary recommendation, immediate dismissal. Forfeiture of unvested pension. Civil action to recover compensation received for fraudulent work product. I read it 3 times. This was it. My father's career, his reputation, his financial security, all gone. Because of evidence I'd provided. Because of truth I'd told. My phone rang 20 minutes later. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. Hello? Brittany. My mother's voice shaking so badly, I could barely understand her. Brittany, you need to come. Right now, please. Mum, I can't. Your father is on the roof. She was crying now, the words tumbling out in gasps. He got the email. He read it. He went up to the roof and he's standing at the edge and he won't come down. I tried to stop him, but he pushed past me and I can't. The phone nearly slipped from my hand. Did you call 911? He said, if I call the police, he'll jump. He said the only person he'll talk to is you. Please, Brittany, I know I have no right to ask. I know you hate us, but please. He's your father. Please. I was already grabbing my keys, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind screamed, I'm coming. I'm 20 minutes away. Keep him talking. Don't let him just keep him talking. I drove faster than I ever had, running 2 red lights, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked too beautiful for what was happening. On day 7, Father's preliminary verdict arrived. Evidence supports termination for cause. That night, Mother called me, voice shaking. Your father is on the roof. Please. I pulled into the driveway with my tyres screaming, barely remembering to put the car in park before I was running toward the house. The front door was open and my mother stood in the entrance, her face blotchy and swollen from crying. "Where?" I gasped. She pointed upward wordless, and I took the stairs 3 at a time. Their house was only 2 stories, but there was roof access through a hatch in the master bedroom. Closet, a feature my father had always loved, claiming he liked to go up there, to think, to watch the stars, to be alone. The hatch was open, evening light streaming down through the square opening. I climbed the metal ladder, my hands slipping on the rungs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I emerged onto the flat roof, and the sunset hit me first, brilliant orange and purple, streaking across the sky, beautiful and terrible. Then I saw him. My father stood at the edge of the roof, 15 feet from where I'd climbed up. The house sat on a hill, and this side dropped away sharply to the street below. 15 floors worth of distance. Enough to kill. More than enough. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking down, his body swaying slightly, and in his right hand he held papers. Even from here I could see his handwriting, could see the words, "To my family," at the top of the page. A goodbye letter. "Dad." My voice came out steady somehow, though everything inside me was screaming. "Step back from the edge." He turned his head, and the expression on his face broke something in me. It wasn't anger or defiance. It was emptiness. The complete absence of hope. "You came," he said, his voice flat. "I didn't think you would." Of course I came. I took a careful step forward, my hands raised like I was approaching a wild animal. "Please step back. We can talk. Whatever this is, we can talk about it." He laughed, and the sound was worse than crying. "Talk about what, Brittany? About how I destroyed my career, my reputation, my family, about how everyone I've worked with for 25 years now knows I'm a fraud." He waved the papers, and I watched them flutter dangerously in the evening breeze. "There's nothing to talk about. It's over." "It doesn't have to be," I said, taking another step. 10 feet between us now. "You made mistakes. Terrible mistakes. But you're still here. You can still..." "Still what?" He turned to face me fully, and I saw tears on his face, cutting through the stubble he hadn't shaved in days. Still face criminal charges, still lose my pension, still watch my son refuse to speak to me, still live in a town where everyone knows what I did. He shook his head. "I can't fix this, Brittany. My career is over. My son hates me. You hate me. Your mother looks at me like I'm a stranger. What's left?" "Life," I said desperately. "There's still life. There's still the possibility of what redemption?" He laughed again, bitter and hollow. "I don't deserve redemption. I stole from you, from my own daughter. I stole from people who trusted me. I built everything on lies, and now it's all gone, and it should be gone because I didn't earn any of it." I was close enough now to see that his hands were shaking, that his eyes were red and swollen, that he looked smaller, somehow diminished. Nothing like the powerful father figure who dominated my childhood. "You're right," I said, and he blinked surprised. "You don't deserve easy redemption. You don't deserve to have this erased or forgiven quickly. But you know what else you don't deserve? You don't deserve the easy way out. You don't deserve to escape accountability by jumping off this roof." "I'm not escaping," he said. "I'm ending it. There's a difference." "No," I said firmly, taking another step. "You're running, like you've always run from anything difficult. You ran from being a good father because it was hard. You ran from honest work because theft was easier. And now you want to run from the consequences of your choices by dying and leaving the rest of us to clean up the mess." His face crumpled. "I don't know how to live with what I've done." "Then learn," I said. "That's what accountability means. You sit with it. You face it. You do the hard work of becoming someone different." "I'm too old to change," he whispered. "Then die trying," I said. "But not like this. Not by jumping off a building and traumatizing your wife destroying what's left of your son's ability to forgive you and leaving me to wonder for the rest of my life if I'm responsible for your death. Something shifted in his expression. You're not responsible, aren't I? I moved closer, just 5 feet away now. I provided the evidence. I testified. I set all of this in motion. If you jump, do you really think I'll be able to tell myself I'm not responsible? You were right to do it, he said, and fresh tears spilled down his face. You were right to expose me. I deserved all of it. Maybe, I said, but I don't want you dead. I want you accountable. I want you to face what you did and try to be better. I want you to do the hard work of apologizing to everyone you hurt. I want you to spend years making amends, being honest, being the father you should have been. My voice broke. I want you to prove that people can change Dad, because if you can't, then what hope is there for any of us? He stood there swaying the goodbye letter clutched in his hand, and I saw the war happening inside him. The desire to end the pain versus the possibility, however faint, of something else. Step back, I said gently. Please, just step back from the edge. He took a breath, and I thought he was going to do it, thought I'd reached him. But then, his foot shifted on the loose gravel that covered the roof, and he stumbled. Time slowed. I saw his arms windmill, saw his body tilt backward toward open air, saw the papers slip from his hand and start to float away on the wind. I lunged. My hands caught his arm and his weight pulled me forward. For one terrifying moment, we were both going over. Then my knee hit the low wall that edged the roof. My other hand grabbed the metal railing of the roof access, and I pulled. We collapsed backward onto the roof together, hitting hard enough that the air rushed out of my lungs. My father landed half on top of me, and for a second, neither of us moved, both of us gasping for breath. Then he started to sob. Not quiet tears, not dignified grief. He sobbed like a child, his body shaking with the force of it making sounds I'd never heard from him before. He curled into himself there on the roof, his hands clutching at the gravel, and cried like something inside him had finally completely broken. I sat up, my hand shaking, my heart hammering, and pulled out my phone. My fingers barely worked as I dialed 911. My father tried to jump from a roof, I told the dispatcher, my voice surprisingly calm. He's safe now, but he needs help. Psychiatric help. Please, send someone. They arrived within 10 minutes. Paramedics, police, a crisis counsellor. My mother had called them too, I learned later, the moment she heard us crash onto the roof. They treated my father gently, talking to him in low voices, checking him for injuries, convincing him to come down from the roof. They loaded him into an ambulance, and I watched from the driveway as they prepared to leave. Just before they closed the doors, my father looked at me through the window. Our eyes met and he mouthed 2 words, "Why me?" I walked to the ambulance and the paramedic opened the door slightly so I could speak to him. "Why did you save me?" my father whispered, his voice hoarse from crying. I looked at this man who'd hurt me, who'd stolen from me, who'd made me feel worthless for 35 years. I looked at him broken and desperate and facing the consequences of his choices. "Because I needed to prove I'm not you," I said quietly. The paramedic closed the door. The ambulance pulled away, lights flashing in the gathering dark. I called 911. They took father to psychiatric hospital. Before the ambulance left, he whispered, "Why did you save me?" I answered, "Because I needed to prove I'm not you." My father spent 3 weeks in the psychiatric hospital. 3 weeks of evaluation, medication, adjustment therapy, and what the doctors called crisis stabilization. I visited twice. Short visits, awkward and painful, where we didn't talk about the roof or the investigation or anything that mattered. We talked about the hospital food and the weather and whether the medication was helping him sleep. My mother visited every day. Brandon visited once, stayed for 15 minutes, and left looking shattered. Claire, I learned, had moved back to Boston. The engagement was officially over. During those 3 weeks, the investigation concluded. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and damning. 15 years of intellectual property theft, plagiarism, and fraud. The legal team's recommendation was unequivocal immediate termination, forfeiture of all pension benefits, civil lawsuit to recover bonuses paid for fraudulent work, and referral to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. CEO Jameson called me in the middle of week 3. The board is meeting next Monday to make a final decision. They'd like you to attend, to provide your testimony in person, and to answer any questions they might have. Will my father be there? No, he's still hospitalised. He'll be represented by his lawyer. Monday morning, week 4. I put on my charcoal suit again, the one I'd worn to the wedding that felt like it had happened in another lifetime. I drove to Jameson Corporation headquarters, rode the elevator to the executive floor, and was shown into a large boardroom with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. 12 board members sat around a massive oak table. CEO Jameson at the head. My father's lawyer, a tired-looking man in his 60s, sat to one side with a folder that I assumed contained my father's defence, such as it was. I took my seat at the opposite end of the table and felt 12 pairs of eyes assess me. Jameson opened the meeting with a summary of the investigation. Then he asked me to provide my testimony. I walked them through everything again: the rejected job application, the stolen Project Phoenix files, my grandmother's documentation, the pattern of theft from other employees. Miss Shaw, one board member, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, said when I finished, "You've provided damning evidence against your own father, evidence that will destroy his career and potentially result in criminal charges. I have to ask, do you have any regrets about coming forward?" I took a breath. I regret that it was necessary. I don't regret telling the truth. And what outcome are you hoping for today? Another board member asked. This was it, the question I'd been wrestling with for 3 weeks. I looked around the table at these powerful people who held my father's fate in their hands, and I realised they were asking me to decide. I want accountability, I said slowly, but I don't want destruction. And I've been thinking about the difference. Emma, sir, Jameson leaned forward, slightly interested. Fire him, I continued. Absolutely fire him. He violated every principle this company stands for. But don't prosecute him criminally. Don't sue him civilly. Because that's not about accountability anymore. That's about revenge. And I don't want to be someone who seeks revenge against a man who just spent 3 weeks in psychiatric care after attempting suicide. The room was silent. Instead, I said, my voice gaining strength, make his termination contingent on conditions, require him to attend therapy weekly for at least a year. Require him to write formal apology letters to every person whose work he stole, every colleague he defrauded. Make those letters part of his permanent record. Reduce his pension. He doesn't deserve full benefits, but don't eliminate it entirely. Leave him enough to survive, but not enough to be comfortable. Make him live with the consequences, not escape them through bankruptcy or prison. That's remarkably generous, the lawyer said carefully, given what he did to you. It's not generous, I corrected. It's strategic. If you prosecute him, he becomes a victim. If you destroy him completely, his story becomes about harsh corporate punishment. But if you hold him accountable while giving him a chance to do better, then his story becomes about a man who has to earn redemption. That's harder. That requires more from him. And frankly, I think that's the greater punishment. One of the board members, an older man with silver hair, nodded slowly. You're proposing restorative justice. I'm proposing we break the cycle, I said. My father was raised by a man who told him he'd never amount to anything, who beat confidence out of him, who made him believe his only value came from appearing successful. So he built a career on lies because he didn't believe his own work was good enough. And then he raised me the same way, telling me I wasn't enough, couldn't be enough, would never be enough. I looked around the table. I'm choosing to be different. I'm choosing to believe that people can change if given the chance. but they have to do the work. Jameson was watching me with something that looked like admiration. The district attorney's office has expressed interest in prosecuting, he said. They believe they have a strong case for fraud and intellectual property theft. They do have a strong case, I agreed, but they can't prosecute without my cooperation. I'm the primary victim. If I refuse to testify, their case falls apart. You would refuse to testify? The sharp-eyed woman asked. Yes, I said firmly, not because he doesn't deserve prosecution, but because I deserve peace. And dragging this through criminal court for years won't give me that. The board debated for 30 minutes while I sat there listening to them weigh justice against mercy, accountability against destruction, cost-benefit analysis against human consideration. Some argued for maximum punishment. Others agreed with my approach. The debate was vigorous but respectful. Finally, Jameson called for a vote. All in favour of Ms. Shaw's proposal termination for cause pension reduction, mandatory therapy and apology letters, no criminal or civil prosecution. Raise your hands. 8 hands went up. Opposed, 2 hands. The debate had been closer than I'd thought. The motion carries, Jameson said. Richard Shaw will be terminated effective immediately. Pension reduced to 40% of entitled amount. Continuation contingent on proof of ongoing therapy and completion of written apologies to all identified victims within 6 months. He looked at me. Ms. Shaw, the board thanks you for your testimony and your recommendation. This took considerable courage. This took more courage than destroying him would have, one of the board members said quietly. Revenge is easy. This is hard. The meeting adjourned. Board members filed out, some stopping to shake my hand to express admiration or concern, or both. My father's lawyer approached me as I gathered my things. Ms. Shaw, he said, extending his hand, I want you to know that what you did today, giving him a chance instead of burying him, it means something. He's still in the hospital, but when I tell him about this, I think it might be the first moment of hope he's had in weeks. I shook his hand but said nothing. I wasn't doing this to give my father hope. I was doing this to give myself peace. As I walked toward the elevator, Jameson caught up with me. Ms. Shaw, could we talk for a moment privately? He led me to his office, a corner suite, with windows that looked out over the city. He gestured for me to sit, then sat across from me, his expression serious. I want to offer you something, he said. I'm retiring next year. I've been planning it for a while, but recent events have made it clear it's time. The board has been discussing succession, and after today, after seeing how you handled that situation, I'd like to recommend you as my replacement. I stared at him, certain I'd misheard. As CEO. As CEO, he confirmed. You have the strategic mind for it, the integrity, the courage to make hard decisions, the wisdom to choose mercy when others would choose revenge. Those are the qualities this company needs. I don't have experience running a company, I said, still processing. You have experience saving one, he countered, and that's harder. The rest you can learn. I looked out the window at the city below, at the building where my father had worked for 25 years, where he'd built his fraudulent career, where he'd reached heights he'd never earned. Can I ask you something? Of course. Could I work here? I asked. In this building, knowing what happened. Knowing that every person here knows my father was a fraud. Knowing they'll always wonder if I got the position because you feel guilty. Jameson was quiet for a moment. I don't know, he said honestly. That's something only you can answer. After the meeting, CEO said, I'm retiring next year, Brittany. I want you to take over as CEO. But first, can you work in the building where your father fell? I didn't answer immediately, because I didn't know. I left Jameson's office without answering his question about the CEO position. I told him I needed time to think, and he graciously agreed to give me a few weeks. I drove home in a daze, parked in my usual spot, and sat in my car for 20 minutes trying to figure out if I felt relieved or empty or something else entirely. The next 2 days passed in a fog of exhaustion. I slept 12 hours at a stretch, woke up disoriented, and couldn't summon the energy to do much beyond basic survival tasks. My phone rang constantly, reporters who'd somehow gotten my number, distant relatives with opinions, former colleagues curious about the drama. I ignored them all. On the third day, Wednesday afternoon, my doorbell rang. I considered not answering, but something made me check the peephole, and I saw Brandon standing there in jeans and a wrinkled t-shirt, looking nothing like the polished groom I'd seen at the failed wedding 4 weeks ago. He'd lost weight, had circles under his eyes, looked like I felt. I opened the door. "Can I come in?" he asked. "Please, I need to talk to you." I stepped aside, and he entered my apartment, looking around at my space as if seeing it for the first time, though he'd been here before. Maybe he was seeing it differently now, seeing me differently. We sat in my living room, an awkward silence stretching between us. Finally, he spoke. "I need to tell you something," he said, his hands clasped between his knees, his voice low. "Something I should have told you weeks ago, but I was a coward." "What is it?" He took a deep breath. "I sent the anonymous tip to HR, the one that corroborated your grandmother's evidence. That gave them additional documentation of Dad's theft." I stared at him, processing. "You, me." He pulled out his phone, opened an email, and handed it to me. I read the message sent from a burner email account to Jameson Corporation's HR department, dated the morning after the wedding. It contained screenshots of files from our father's laptop metadata, showing stolen work dates and timestamps that matched what my grandmother had documented. "I don't understand," I said slowly. "How did you get these?" "The night before the wedding," Brandon said, his voice tight with something that might have been shame. "I couldn't sleep. I was nervous about the ceremony, about Claire, about everything. I went downstairs around 2 a.m. to get water, and I saw light coming from Dad's study. He'd fallen asleep at his desk. His laptop was open." He paused, and I waited. I was just going to close it for him, wake him up, send him to bed. But I saw what was on the screen. Email drafts, files with your name on them, but being prepared to submit under his name. I started clicking around, and the more I looked, the worse it got. Years of files, other people's work, your work, everything. "And you didn't say anything," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Not then," he admitted. "I should have. I know I should have, but I was in shock, and I told myself maybe I'd misunderstood, maybe there was an explanation. So I just took screenshots, lots of them, and I closed the laptop and went back to bed and spent the rest of the night staring at my phone, looking at proof that my father was a fraud." "Why didn't you tell me before the wedding?" "Because I was a coward," he said simply. "Because I wanted my wedding day. Because I didn't want to believe it. Because I'd spent my whole life being the golden child, and accepting this truth meant accepting that everything I'd been given, every advantage, every opportunity, every moment of Dad's pride, it was all built on you being diminished, on you being erased." His voice cracked on that last word. "But then I watched the wedding morning happen," he continued. "I watched Mum hand you that staff apron. I watched Dad introduce you to guests as helping out. I watched you serve drinks and set up chairs and be treated like hired help. And I knew it wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding or just them being thoughtless. It was deliberate. It was systematic. It was who they'd always been." "So you sent the tip," I said. "After you revealed yourself to Jameson, after I saw Dad's face when he realised who you really were after I watched the whole thing implode? Yes, I sent the tip, because I realised I'd been complicit my entire life. I'd accepted the privilege, accepted the praise, accepted being loved while you were ignored, and I had a choice: keep being complicit, or finally do something right." He looked at me directly, his eyes red-rimmed. I exposed a thief, not my father. A thief, someone who built his career stealing from people who trusted him, including his own daughter. I'm just sorry it took me 30 years to see you. I sat there absorbing this. Brandon, the golden child, the favoured son, the one who'd had everything handed to him, had been the anonymous source that had sealed our father's fate. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Because you saved his life, Brandon said. Why? You pulled him back from that ledge when you had every reason to let him fall. And then you gave him mercy at that board meeting when you could have destroyed him completely. And I realised you're so much better than any of us, than me especially. And I needed you to know that I tried at least at the end to do the right thing, even if it was too late. It wasn't too late, I said quietly. Your evidence corroborated grandmother's documentation. It made the case stronger. It meant the board couldn't dismiss it as a family grudge or a misunderstanding. Does that make up for 30 years of silence? No, I said honestly. But it's a start. He nodded, accepting that, and stood up. I'm going back to Stanford, talking to my old professors about research positions. Starting over, basically. Claire's gone. The wedding money's gone. Dad's reputation is gone, which means my connections through him are gone, so I'm rebuilding from scratch. That's good, I said and meant it. And Britt, he used my nickname, the one only our grandmother had used regularly. I'm proud of you. I should have said that years ago. Decades ago. But I'm saying it now. I'm proud of who you became without any of us. Despite all of us. He left then, and I stood at my window watching him walk to his car, watching him drive away. My little brother who'd finally seen me. I felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly. Not yet, but something softer than the anger I'd carried for so long. The recognition that people could change, could grow, could choose differently even after years of choosing wrong. My phone buzzed. An email notification. I picked it up expecting another reporter or curious colleague. Instead, I saw a name I hadn't expected, Claire Montgomery. Subject line, I owe you an apology. The preview text read, Brittany. I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I need to explain some things and apologise for others. Can we meet? Please, I'm in town through Friday. Coffee, lunch, anything. I'll understand if you say no, but I'm asking anyway. Claire. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the delete button. Claire, who'd mocked me at the rehearsal dinner, who'd planted her bracelet in my bag, who'd taken my mother's money to keep me in my place, who'd watched me be humiliated and done nothing to stop it. After everything she'd done, after the lies and the cruelty and the calculated meanness, did I really want to hear what she had to say? Brandon left. An hour later, I got an email from Claire. I owe you an apology. Can we meet? I stared at the screen. After everything she'd done, could I hear her out? I sat there for 10 minutes, staring at Claire's email, my finger hovering between reply and delete. Every rational part of me said delete it. Move on. She didn't deserve my time or my attention or my willingness to listen. But I just watched Brandon confess his complicity and take responsibility. I'd chosen mercy for my father when I could have chosen destruction. Maybe I thought I owed it to myself to hear what Claire had to say, not for her sake, for mine, to see if I could sit across from someone who'd hurt me and maintain the composure I'd fought so hard to build. I replied, Friday, 2 p.m, Cornerstone Cafe on 5th Street. Her response came within minutes. I'll be there, thank you. Friday afternoon, I arrived at the cafe 15 minutes early, ordered coffee I didn't really want, and sat at a corner table where I could see the door. Claire arrived exactly at 2 and I barely recognised her. Gone was the polished bride-to-be with perfect hair and designer clothes. This, Claire wore jeans and a plain sweater, minimal makeup, her blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. When she saw me, relief and anxiety warred on her face. She ordered tea and sat down across from me, her hands wrapped around the cup like she needed its warmth. "Thank you for meeting me," she said quietly. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure I would either," I said. "But I'm here. So, talk." She took a breath. "I need to start by saying I'm sorry for everything, for how I treated you at the rehearsal dinner, for planting my bracelet in your bag, for taking your mother's money, for being complicit in making you feel invisible at what should have been a family celebration." "I know about the money," I said flatly. "My mother told me. $10,000 to keep me away from important guests, to neutralize me." Claire flinched. "She told you. She showed me the texts, the instructions, the wire transfer, all of it." "Then you know I'm not here to confess something you don't already know," Claire said. "I'm here to explain why I did it, not to excuse it. I can't excuse it, but to explain." "I'm listening." She set down her tea and pulled out her phone, opening a banking app. She turned the screen to show me her account balance from 3 months ago, negative 847. Student loans and collections, credit cards maxed out, a financial disaster. "I graduated from Boston University with a degree in marketing and $80,000 in student debt," she said. "I was working 2 jobs, living with 3 roommates, eating ramen for dinner most nights. I met Brandon at a networking event. He was charming and successful and from a family with money, and I thought..." She stopped, shook her head. "I thought he was my way out. That's ugly to admit, but it's true." "So you were marrying him for money," I said. "I was marrying him for stability," she corrected. "For a life where I didn't have to choose between rent and student loan payments, where I could breathe. And then your mother approached me with an offer. $10,000. $10,000, she confirmed, which was exactly what I needed to pay off my most urgent debts, to get the collection agencies off my back, to have something in my savings account for the first time in 3 years." She looked down at her hands. "So I said yes. I told myself it was harmless, that I was just helping manage family dynamics, keeping things running smoothly for the wedding. I didn't think about what it meant, that I was being paid to marginalize you, to keep you small. Until the wedding," I said. "Until the wedding," she agreed. "Until I watched your father introduce you as helping out instead of his daughter. Until I heard guests whisper about why you were wearing a staff apron. Until CEO Jameson revealed who you really were, and I realized I'd been paid to humiliate a woman who'd saved an entire company. A woman who was brilliant and accomplished and had more integrity in her little finger than I had in my entire body." Her voice cracked slightly. "I felt sick," she continued, "physically sick. I went to the bathroom and threw up, because I'd taken money to hurt someone who didn't deserve it, because I'd let myself be bought, because I'd become exactly the kind of person I'd always promised myself I wouldn't be." I watched her carefully, trying to determine if this was genuine or performance. "Why should I believe you?" "You shouldn't," she said simply. "You have no reason to, but I'm going to tell you the truth anyway. After the wedding fell apart, after Brandon broke it off after I went back to Boston, I couldn't stop thinking about you, about what your mother paid me to do, about the kind of person that made me." Chet. She pulled out another document from her bag, a printed email. "I wrote to all the people I owed money to, told them I was going to pay them back in full, but it would take time. I got a 3rd job, I'm working 60 hours a week, and I'm using every extra cent to pay back those debts without touching your mother's money." "You still have it?" I asked, surprised. "Every cent. It's been sitting in my savings account for 4 weeks. I can't spend it. Every time I look at it, I see your face when they searched your bag. I see you standing there in that staff apron, dignified and composed, while we all treated you like you didn't matter." She slid a piece of paper across the table. A bank statement showing $10,000 in her savings account untouched. "I want to give it back," she said. "To you, to your mother, To charity, I don't care. I just want it gone. Tell me what to do with it and I'll do it. I looked at the statement at this woman who'd hurt me sitting across from me with something that looked like genuine remorse, and I made a decision. Keep it, I said. She blinked. What? Keep the money, but donate it, all of it, to a women's shelter. One that helps women escape abusive situations, rebuild their lives, find their own worth. Send me the receipt when it's done. That's your penance. Claire's eyes filled with tears. Brittany, I don't deserve. You don't, I agreed. But I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for women who need help more than you need punishment. And I'm doing it for myself. Because I'm choosing to believe that people can do better when they're given the chance to do better. I will, she said, her voice thick. I'll send you the receipt by next week. And, Brittany, I know this doesn't fix anything, but I want you to know you're extraordinary. Not because of what you've accomplished professionally, but because of who you are. The grace you've shown, the mercy you've chosen, the way you've handled all of this. You deserved so much better than how we treated you. Yes, I said simply. I did. We sat there for a moment longer, then she stood gathering her things. Thank you for listening. I know you didn't have to. After she left, I sat in the cafe for another hour processing. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Can you come by the house tonight? I need to talk to you. I almost said no, almost deleted the message and went home to my own space, my own life away from all of them. But something pulled me back. Maybe it was the same instinct that had made me meet Claire. Maybe it was just exhaustion. Or maybe it was the need for one more conversation. One more chance to understand how everything had gone so wrong. I drove to my parents' house as the sun set. The lights were on, but it looked different somehow. Less like home, more like a stage where a tragedy had played out. My mother opened the door before I could knock. She was waiting. Come in, she said quietly. We went to the living room. She didn't offer coffee or tea, just sat on the couch and looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. Claire, told you, she said. It wasn't a question. She told me she gave back the money, that she donated it, that she was sorry for taking it in the first place. She called me, my mother said, told me what you asked her to do, asked if I wanted to stop her. I said no. Why? The question came out harsher than I intended. Why did you do it, Mum? Why did you pay someone to humiliate me? My mother's answer came slowly, each word seeming to cost her something. Because I was taught that daughters should be quiet and sons should shine. I was wrong, but I didn't know how to unlearn it. I drove home and found Mother waiting in the dark. Claire told you, she said. It wasn't a question. Why? I asked. Mother's answer shattered me. Because I was taught that daughters should be quiet and sons should shine. I was wrong, but I didn't know how to unlearn it. The words hung in the air between us, and something inside me snapped. Not the sharp break of the sudden anger, but the slow, inevitable collapse of a structure that had been crumbling for decades. That's your excuse. I said, my voice low and dangerous. That you were taught wrong, so you taught me wrong. That you were made to feel small, so you made me feel small. That's supposed to make it better. It's not an excuse. My mother said, her voice trembling. It's an explanation. I don't want your explanations. The words exploded out of me louder than I'd intended, echoing in the quiet house. I want to know why you chose him over me. Every single time. Why you stood by and watched him tear me down. Why you not only let it happen, but actively participated in it. Why you paid someone $10,000 to ensure I stayed invisible at my own brother's wedding. My mother flinched with each accusation, but I couldn't stop. 35 years of silence was pouring out of me, like a dam breaking. Do you know what it's like. I continued, my voice shaking now. To grow up knowing your own mother sees you as a problem to be managed, to watch her light up for your brother and go cold for you, to spend your entire childhood trying to figure out what you did wrong, why you weren't worthy of the same love. Brittany, I won a state science competition at 8 years old. I was on my feet now, panicking. 8. Do you remember what you said to me? You said, "That's nice, honey, but don't brag about it at school. Nobody likes a show-off." I wasn't bragging, Mum. I was excited. I wanted you to be excited with me. But you were worried I'd make other kids feel bad, that I'd make Brandon feel less special. I was trying to protect you. You were trying to make me smaller. My voice cracked. You were trying to dim my light so Brandon's could shine brighter. And you did it my whole life. Every achievement, every success, every moment I tried to show you who I was, you shut it down. You taught me that being good at things was something to hide, that my intelligence was a burden, that my very existence was too much. My mother was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face, but I couldn't stop. And the worst part, I said, my voice dropping to barely above a whisper, the worst part is that you made me complicit in my own erasure. You taught me to be so afraid of taking up space that I spent decades hiding who I really was. I built an entire alternate identity just so I could succeed without threatening anyone. Do you understand how sick that is? That I had to pretend to be someone else to feel safe being good at something. I know, my mother said, her voice breaking. I know, and I'm sorry. Sorry isn't enough, I shouted. Sorry doesn't give me back my childhood. Sorry doesn't undo 35 years of being made to feel worthless. Sorry doesn't... I stopped, my breath coming in gasps and my hand shaking. I sat down heavily on the couch, suddenly exhausted. The silence stretched. My mother wiped her face with trembling hands. You're right, she said finally. Sorry isn't enough. Nothing I say will be enough. But I need you to understand something, even if it doesn't change anything. I didn't respond, but she continued anyway. Your father didn't start out cruel, she said quietly. When we married, he was kind, gentle, but his father, your grandfather, he was a monster. He beat your father, told him every day that he was worthless, that he'd never amount to anything. Called him weak for showing emotion, for being sensitive for every perceived flaw. She paused, swallowing hard. And when you were born, when it was clear from the beginning that you were brilliant, your grandfather said something to your father that I'll never forget. He said, "A man who raises a daughter smarter than him is no man at all." I closed my eyes, feeling something twist in my chest. Your father changed after that, she continued. Started withdrawing from you, started focusing on Brandon, and I saw what was happening, but I was trapped. I had no job, no money of my own, no degree, no career, nothing. I'd given up everything to be a wife and mother. And your father, he never hit me, but he punished me in other ways, with silence, with coldness, with threats about what would happen if I left. So you sacrificed me to keep him happy, I said flatly. I sacrificed both of us. Oh, she said. Every time I praised you, he'd withdraw for days. Every time I showed pride in your achievements, he'd find ways to undermine you more. So I learned to stay quiet, to protect you by making you invisible. I told myself I was keeping the peace, that I was keeping the family together. She looked at me with my red, swollen eyes. But I was really just being a coward. Yes, I said, you were. She nodded, accepting that. Then she stood slowly and walked to a closet in the hallway. She pulled out a cardboard box, old and worn, and brought it back to the living room. She set it on the coffee table between us and lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of items, certificates, newspaper clippings, photographs, ribbons, awards, all mine. Everything from my science fair trophy at 8 to my college acceptance letter to articles about my consulting work that she'd somehow found and printed. "I kept everything," she said quietly. "Every achievement, every award, every mention of you I could find. I kept them in this box, and I'd take them out at night when your father was asleep, and I'd read them. I'd look at your face in these photos and feel so proud I could barely breathe. And then I'd put them away again before anyone could see." I stared at the box at 35 years of my life, documented and hidden, and felt something crack open in my chest. "Why didn't you just leave him?" I asked, my voice small now, all the anger drained away. "If you were so proud of me, if you knew what he was doing was wrong, why didn't you take us and leave?" "Because I was terrified," she said simply. "Terrified of being alone, of not being able to support myself, of your father fighting for custody and winning because he had money and career and I had nothing, of making things worse for you. So I stayed, and I told myself I was doing the right thing, but I wasn't. I was just too scared to do the hard thing." We sat there in silence, the box of hidden achievements between us, like evidence of all the love that had been too dangerous to show. "I don't forgive you," I said finally. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. What you did, what you didn't do, it hurt me in ways I'm still discovering. It shaped me in ways I'm still trying to unlearn." "I know," she said, "but I understand now." I continued. "I understand that you were trapped in your own way, that you made terrible choices out of fear, that you perpetuated a cycle you didn't know how to break." I looked at her directly. "We both need therapy, Mum, separately, with professionals who can help us process this. And maybe someday, if we both do the work, we can try family therapy together." "I'd like that," she said, her voice barely audible. "I started calling therapists yesterday. I have an appointment next Tuesday." "Good," I said. "That's good." I stood to leave, and she walked me to the door. On the threshold, she touched my arm lightly. "For what it's worth," she said, "you became extraordinary in spite of us, not because of us. And that makes you stronger than I ever was." "I know," I said, and I left. The next week passed in a haze of normal life trying to reassert itself. Work calls, grocery shopping, long runs where I tried to outpace my thoughts. I started researching therapists, made appointments, began the long work of untangling 35 years of damage. And then, exactly 1 week after the conversation with my mother, a letter arrived. The return address was St. Mary's Psychiatric Hospital. The name on the sender line, Richard Shaw, my father. I stood in my kitchen, holding the envelope, my hands shaking. The paper was standard hospital stationery, thin and institutional. I could feel multiple pages inside, could see handwriting through the envelope. This could be anything. An apology, an excuse, a justification, a goodbye, another manipulation, another wound. I set it on my kitchen table and stared at it. Made coffee. Drank coffee. Stared at it some more. 20 minutes passed. A week later, a letter arrived from the psychiatric hospital. From Father. My hands shook as I held it. This could be an apology. Or an excuse. Or goodbye. I sat there for 20 minutes, unable to open it. Finally, I opened it. The handwriting was shaky, nothing like my father's usual confident script. The pages were dated, written over several days. I unfolded them and began to read. "Dear Brittany," it started. "The therapists here tell me I need to write this letter. Not for you, they're clear about that, but for me, as part of what they call accountability work. But as I write, I realise this is for you, because you deserve to hear things I should have said 35 years ago." I took a breath and kept reading. "I need to tell you about my father. Your grandfather. He died when you were 6, and you barely remember him, which is a mercy. He was a cruel man. He beat me regularly, not for misbehaviour, for existing, for being sensitive, for crying, for showing any emotion he deemed weak. He told me I was worthless so many times I started to believe it. When I got into college, he said I'd flunk out. When I graduated, he said I'd never hold a real job. When I married your mother, he said no woman would stay with someone as pathetic as me. My throat tightened. And then you were born, my daughter. And from the moment you were born, you were brilliant. You spoke early, walked early, asked questions that stunned the pediatrician. And my father looked at you and said to me, a man who raises a daughter smarter than him is no man at all. I laughed it off, but the words burrowed into me like parasites. I set the letter down for a moment, my hand shaking, then picked it up again. Every time you succeeded, I heard his voice. Every trophy, every award, every perfect test score, it was proof that he was right about me, that I was weak, that I'd failed as a father because my daughter was surpassing me. So I made you small so I could feel big. I dismissed your achievements. I stole your work. I built my career on your brilliance while telling you that you weren't good enough. And the horrible truth is, I knew what I was doing. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't stop. Because stopping would mean facing the fact that I was exactly what my father said I was. Tears were streaming down my face now. Project Phoenix, he continued, the work that saved Jameson Corporation. I found it on your laptop and I knew immediately what it was. Genius, pure genius. And I thought, if I submit this, maybe I'll finally feel like I deserve my position. Maybe I'll finally silence my father's voice in my head. But it didn't work. The promotion, the commendation, the respect, none of it made me feel better. Because deep down, I knew it wasn't mine. I knew I was a fraud. The next paragraph was written in an even shakier hand. What I did to you was unforgivable. Not just the theft, the entire lifetime of making you feel worthless, of treating your intelligence like a threat instead of a gift, of being the father who diminished instead of celebrated. You became extraordinary not because of me, but despite me. And that's my greatest shame, because you deserved better. You deserved a father who championed you, who protected you, who told you every single day that you were brilliant and capable and worthy of love. The final page was dated yesterday. I'm proud of you, Brittany. I need you to know that. I was always proud, even when I couldn't say it, even when I was tearing you down. Some sick, twisted part of me was bursting with pride at who you were becoming, while the rest of me was terrified by it. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I need you to know everything you've accomplished, every bit of success, every moment of brilliance, that's all you. That was never me. You did that yourself, and I'm sorry I made you do it alone. He signed it simply, Dad. I read the letter twice, then a third time. Then I set it down on my kitchen table and cried for an hour. Not the angry tears I'd cried before. Not the bitter tears of betrayal. These were different. These were the tears of a daughter who'd spent 35 years wondering if her father had ever loved her, ever seen her, ever felt anything other than disappointment when he looked at her. The letter didn't erase the damage, didn't undo the theft or the humiliation or the decades of feeling worthless. But it gave me something I'd needed my entire life, an acknowledgement of what had been taken from me, an admission that it wasn't my fault, that I wasn't too much or too difficult or too threatening, that the problem had never been me. When I could breathe again, when the tears finally stopped, I picked up my phone and searched my contacts. I found the number I'd saved weeks ago, Dr. Sarah Chen, my father's therapist at St. Mary's. She answered on the second ring. Dr. Chen speaking. This is Brittany Shaw, I said, my voice hoarse from crying. Richard Shaw's daughter. I received his letter today. Ah, she said, and I heard understanding in that single syllable. How are you feeling? I don't know, I admitted, but I have a question. Can I visit him? I read the letter twice, then cried for an hour, not because I forgave him, but because I finally heard what I'd needed to hear my whole life. I picked up my phone and called his therapist. Can I visit him? Dr. Chen scheduled the visit for Saturday afternoon. He's doing better, she told me. Medication is stabilized. He's engaged in therapy. But Brittany, I want you to know he's fragile. Progress isn't linear. Be prepared for that. I arrived at St. Mary's at 2:00. The psychiatric ward was quieter than I'd expected, calm and sterile. A nurse led me to a small visiting room with 2 chairs, a table, and a window that looked out onto a courtyard garden. My father was already there, standing by the window. He'd lost weight. His hair had gone greyer. He wore hospital-issued clothing and looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, stripped of the suits and confidence that had always made him seem larger than life. He turned when I entered, and I saw fear in his eyes. Real, raw fear. "Brittany," he said, "you came." "I got your letter," I said, sitting down. After a moment, he sat too, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. We sat in silence for a moment. Then I spoke. "Do you remember my 12th birthday?" I asked. He looked confused by the question. "Your 12th? I waited all day for you to come home. Mum had made a cake. Brandon was there. But you didn't show up until almost midnight. You'd forgotten." His face crumpled slightly. "I don't remember that." "I know," I said. "That's the point. Do you remember my college graduation?" I was there." "You were on your phone, the entire ceremony. Brandon's girlfriend sent you a video of his baseball game. You watched it while I walked across the stage to receive my diploma. Summa cum laude. I looked for you in the crowd and you were staring at your phone." "Brittany, I'm not telling you this to hurt you," I interrupted. "I'm telling you because these moments mattered to me. They shaped who I became. And you weren't there. Not really, not for any of it." He was crying now, silent tears tracking down his face. "I can't fix this," he whispered. "I can't give you back those moments. I can't undo what I did." "No," I agreed. "You can't, but you can stop running from it. You can sit with what you did and really feel it and commit to being different." "I'm trying," he said. "The therapy, the medication, the work they're making me do here, it's the hardest thing I've ever done. Harder than any job, any project, because I have to look at myself, really look. And what I see is..." His voice broke. "I see a man who destroyed his own daughter to protect his fragile ego." "Yes," I said simply. "That's what you did." We sat with that truth between us. No excuses, no justifications, just the brutal honesty of it. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said finally. "Not yet, maybe not ever. But I'm willing to try, to see if we can build something honest, something real, not the father-daughter relationship we should have had that's gone, but maybe something new, something based on truth instead of lies." "I'd like that," he said, his voice thick. "What would that look like?" "I'll visit once a month," I said. "We'll talk, really talk. You'll tell me about your therapy, your progress, your struggles. I'll tell you about my life, and we'll see if trust can grow where there was only damage before." "Once a month," he repeated as if testing the words. "I'll take it. That's more than I deserve." "Probably," I agreed. "But I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for me. Because I need to know if healing is possible. If people can really change." He nodded understanding. I stood to leave and he stood too. We faced each other awkwardly, neither of us knowing how to end this conversation. Then he did something unexpected. He extended his hand, not for a hug, not for false intimacy we hadn't earned, but for a handshake. "Thank you," he said, "for saving my life, for giving me this chance, for being the bigger person when I was the smallest." I looked at his outstretched hand. This man who'd stolen from me, diminished me, made me feel worthless for 35 years. This man who was also broken, traumatized, struggling to be better. 5 seconds passed, then 10. An eternity compressed into a moment of decision. Then I took his hand. As I left, Father stood and extended his hand not as boss to employee, but as father to daughter. I looked at his hand for 5 seconds that felt like forever. Then I took it. 2 weeks later, I returned to Jameson Corporation for a special board meeting. This time, I wore my grandmother's pearls and carried her strength with me. CEO Jameson opened the meeting with an announcement. After 30 years with this company, I'm retiring at the end of the fiscal year, and I'm recommending Brittany Shaw as my successor. The room was quiet. 12 board members looked at me with expressions ranging from curiosity to approval to skepticism. Ms. Shaw, the sharp-eyed woman from the previous meeting said, "Do you accept?" "I do," I said, standing, "but I have 3 conditions." Jameson smiled slightly as if he'd expected this. "First," I said, "I want Brandon Shaw hired as a junior analyst, not because he's my brother, but because he has potential and he's willing to do the work to prove himself. He'll receive no special treatment, no nepotism. He succeeds or fails on his own merit." Several board members nodded. "Second, I want to establish a mentorship program specifically for women from unsupportive families. Women who've been told they're not good enough, not smart enough, not worthy. I want this company to be a place where talent is recognized regardless of where it comes from or who believes in it." "That's excellent," one board member said. Others murmured agreement. Third, I took a breath. "I want my father's pension partially restored, not to full benefits, he doesn't deserve that, but enough to live with dignity, 40% of his entitled amount." The room went silent. "Some of you will think that's weakness," I continued, "that I'm being soft on someone who stole from this company from me from others, but here's what I've learned: cruelty is easy. Destroying someone completely is easy. What's hard is holding someone accountable while still seeing their humanity. What's hard is choosing mercy when revenge would feel better. I want to be the kind of leader who chooses hard." The vote was called. 11 hands went up in favour, 1 abstained. After the meeting, the dissenting board member approached me. "I voted no," he said, "not because I disagreed with you, but because I needed to see if you'd fight for what you believed, even when challenged. You did. Welcome aboard, CEO Shaw." That evening, exhausted but strangely peaceful, I found a package on my doorstep. No return address. Inside, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, was my science trophy from age 8, the one my grandfather had convinced my father to destroy, the one that had been smashed and thrown away. Except it wasn't destroyed anymore. Someone had painstakingly glued every piece back together, filled the cracks with gold in the Japanese kintsugi tradition, making the breaks part of the beauty. The trophy was whole again, stronger for having been broken. A note was tucked inside, written in my father's shaky handwriting. "I fixed it. Can we fix us, Dad?" That evening I found a package on my doorstep. Inside, my broken science trophy from age 8, the one father smashed. Someone had repaired it. The cracks were still visible, but it was whole, like me. A note: "I fixed it. Can we fix us, Dad?" 1 year after the wedding that never was, I stood in my kitchen preparing Thanksgiving dinner. My kitchen, in my home. A 3-bedroom townhouse with tall windows and a balcony overlooking the city, purchased with my own money, decorated to my own taste. A space that was entirely mine. The doorbell rang at 4 o'clock. I wiped my hands on my apron and opened it to find my mother standing there with a pie, her face uncertain. "Pumpkin," she said, holding it out like an offering. "Your favourite." "Come in, Mum," I said, and watched her shoulders relax slightly as she stepped inside. 20 minutes later, Brandon arrived carrying wine and looking healthier than he had in months. He'd moved into a modest apartment, was working his way up at Jameson without any special treatment, and had started dating someone new. Someone kind, he'd told me. Someone who didn't care about his family name. "Nice place, Britt," he said, looking around. "You've done well, wow." "We've done well," I corrected, gesturing to a framed photo on the wall. The two of us at a company event, both in professional attire, both smiling genuinely. "Your Q3 analysis was brilliant. Jameson's already talking about promoting you." He flushed with pride, and I remembered what that felt like. To be seen, to be valued. The doorbell rang again at exactly 4:30. My father, punctual as always, stood on the doorstep looking nervous. He'd aged more in the past year than in the previous decade. But his eyes were clearer. Sober for 9 months. Therapy twice a week. Slowly, painfully learning to be honest. "Brittany," he said, "thank you for inviting me." "Come in, Dad," I said and stepped aside. The four of us gathered in my dining room around a table I'd chosen set with dishes I'd picked out in a home I'd built for myself. The awkwardness was palpable. We were strangers learning to be family, and no one quite knew how. But we tried. "Brandon," my mother said, passing him rolls. "How's work going?" "Good, actually," he said, and launched into a story about a client presentation. My father listened, nodding, but not interrupting, not trying to insert his own experience or advice. Just listening. "And you, Richard?" my mother asked carefully. They'd been living separately for the past 6 months, testing whether their marriage could be rebuilt truth instead of pretense. "How's the consulting work?" My father had started doing small freelance projects, actual work this time, building a modest but honest portfolio. "Slow," he admitted, "but mine. For the first time in my life, everything I'm doing is actually mine." There was pride in his voice, but also humility. "So, I've paid back $5,000 so far," he added, looking at me. "To the people whose work I stole, 8,000 more to go. But I'm getting there." "That's good, Dad," I said and meant it. We ate in relative peace, the conversation flowing more naturally as the evening progressed. After the main course, as my mother was clearing plates, my father stood suddenly. "I'd like to say something," he said, his voice unsteady. The room went quiet. "I don't deserve to be at this table," he said, looking at each of us in turn. "I don't deserve your time, your presence, your willingness to sit with me after what I've done. Brittany, you built this life without any help from me. Brandon, you're succeeding on your own merit. Susan, you're finding yourself again. And I'm grateful, so grateful that you're giving me a chance to be part of it. Even just at the edge. I won't waste it." His voice cracked on that last sentence, but he didn't cry, just stood there vulnerable and honest. I looked at this man who'd hurt me so deeply, who was trying so hard to be better, and felt something shift. Not forgiveness, exactly, but something softer. Recognition that healing wasn't linear. That progress was measured in inches, not miles. "You're welcome, Dad," I said quietly. "Now sit down, the pie's getting cold." He sat and we all laughed just a little at the mundane absurdity of that statement after such wait. After dinner, I needed air. I stepped out onto my balcony. The city lights spread before me like possibilities. A moment later, Brandon joined me, 2 glasses of wine in hand. "Quite a year," he said, handing me a glass. "Quite a year," I agreed. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then he asked, "Do you think Dad will make it? Really make it?" I considered the question. A year ago, I would have said no, would have believed that people couldn't change, that damage was permanent, that some wounds never healed. "I don't know," I said honestly. "He might relapse. He might fall back into old patterns. Healing isn't guaranteed." "Then why give him the chance?" I smiled, looking out at the city I'd conquered. the life I'd built, the woman I'd become. Because I'll make it, regardless of what he does, whether he succeeds or fails, whether he becomes the father I deserved or remains the one I got, I'll make it. And that's enough. Brandon looked at me, really looked at me and nodded. Yeah, he said quietly, you will. After dinner, I stood on the balcony. Brandon joined me. You think Dad will make it? I smiled. I don't know, but I'll make it. And that's enough. For the first time in my life, I meant it. 6 months later, I sat in my corner office interviewing a young woman for the mentorship program. Her resume was impressive, but her body language told a different story. Shoulders hunched, eyes down, the posture of someone who'd been made to feel small. Tell me about yourself, I said gently. My family doesn't really support what I'm doing, she said quietly. My father says women don't belong in technology, that I should focus on finding a husband, that my degree is a waste of money. I recognized that pain immediately. And what do you say? She looked up surprised. Does it matter what I say? It's the only thing that matters, I told her. Your family doesn't get to decide your ceiling. You do. Something shifted in her eyes. Hope, maybe, or recognition that someone finally understood. That evening, our company held its annual gala. As CEO, I was expected to give the keynote address. I stood at the podium looking out at 500 faces and spoke about the journey from invisibility to visibility, about women who wait for permission versus women who claim their worth, about the difference between proving others wrong and proving yourself right. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. Afterward, I needed quiet. I drove to the cemetery, where my grandmother was buried, the place where this journey had truly begun. I knelt at her headstone, touching the engraved letters of her name. I did it. Grandma, I whispered. Not perfectly, but I did it. As I stood to leave, I heard crying. A young girl, maybe 10 years old, sat at a nearby grave, her face buried in her hands. I hesitated, then approached. Are you okay? I asked. She looked up, wiping her eyes. My dad says I'll never be as good as my brother, that boys are smarter, that I should stop trying so hard. My heart broke and healed simultaneously. I knelt beside her. Can I tell you something? I said. I used to be you. I had a father who couldn't see me, who told me I wasn't enough, who made me feel invisible. And look how I turned out. How did you turn out? She asked, her voice small. I became CEO of a Fortune 500 company. I created programs to help women like us. I learned that my worth wasn't determined by whether my father could see it. I smiled. And you know what the best part is? I'm happy. Really, truly happy. Not because I proved him wrong, but because I proved myself right. She stared at me with wide eyes. You really think I can do that too? I know you can, I said, but you have to believe it first. I gave her my card, told her to call me when she was older, when she needed someone who understood. Then I walked back to my car, my grandmother's pearls warm against my neck, and drove home with the windows down and music up. That girl's face stayed with me, not because it reminded me of my pain, but my purpose. Some people spend their lives seeking revenge. I chose something harder. I chose to rise. Not to prove them wrong, but to prove myself right. And that made all the difference. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for sitting with me through the pain, the revelation, the messy journey toward healing. I know it wasn't always easy to hear. Stories about family dysfunction, about being overlooked and undervalued, about fighting for recognition in the places where you should have been loved unconditionally. These stories cut deep because so many of us have lived them in one form or another. I want you to know something important. If you saw yourself in any part of my journey, if you recognized your own family dynamics in mine, if you've ever felt invisible or dismissed, or told you weren't enough, you're not alone. Your experience is valid. your pain is real, and your worth has never been dependent on whether the people who should have seen you actually did. But here's what I really want you to take away from this. Healing is possible. Not the Hollywood kind where everything is fixed and perfect and everyone apologizes beautifully and we all live happily ever after. Real healing. The kind where you learn to carry your scars with dignity, where you choose mercy, not because they deserve it, but because you deserve peace, where you stop waiting for permission to be extraordinary and simply become it. I'd love to hear your story. Have you ever had to choose between revenge and rising above? Have you had to prove your worth to people who should have seen it all along? What would you have done in my situation? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective matters, your voice matters, and maybe, just maybe, your story will help someone else who's walking this path right now. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel. Hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because stories like this, stories about ordinary people choosing extraordinary grace, these are the stories that change lives. Not because they're perfect, but because they're true. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And remember, your worth is not negotiable. You don't need anyone's permission to shine. You never did.